Imagine standing at the edge of a harbor so blue it looks painted. The light hits the water at that particular angle you only get in early morning, when the world has not decided yet whether it wants to be cool or warm. You are standing somewhere in what we now call Sydney. The Opera House is behind you. The bridge is to your north. Ferries are cutting white lines across the water. Tourists are already lifting their phones. And under your feet, under the concrete and the sandstone and the cafe foundations and the car parks and the old colonial brickwork that people call heritage, under all of that is something far older, something nobody put on the tourist maps, something that was here for so long that the word ancient barely covers it. Close your eyes for a moment, not literally if you are driving, but in your mind. Go back, not 100 years, not 200. Not even to the first fleet in 1788. Go back much further than that. Go back 10,000 years, 20,000. Go back to a time when the harbour looked almost exactly as it does now, because water and stone changed slowly. But the people standing on those shores, the people fishing those same channels, the people whose children played on those same beaches, those people have been almost completely written out of the story that Sydney tells about itself. Their names do not appear on the monuments. Their land boundaries are not drawn on the city maps. Their laws, their governance systems, their sophisticated understanding of this landscape that took tens of thousands of years to develop, all of it was treated as though it simply did not exist. And, in many cases, the people themselves were treated the same way. This is not a simple story. It is not a comfortable one. And it does not have a clean ending because we are still inside it. But it is one of the most extraordinary and most suppressed stories in Australian history, and it begins long before any European ship appeared on the horizon. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. There is a word that barely gets spoken in the official version of Sydney's origin story. The word is Eora. It comes from the language of the coastal peoples of the Sydney region, and in its simplest translation, it means simply the people, or here. The people who are here. When the British arrived in 1788 and began asking the local inhabitants who they were, the answer they kept receiving, in various forms, was some version of that word. We are the people who are here. We are the ones who belong to this place. And the British, unable or unwilling to pass the nuance in that, wrote it down as a kind of catch-all label, reduced a vast and sophisticated network of clans and nations and family groups into a single category, and then proceeded to ignore even that. But let us start where the story actually starts. Not with a ship, not with a flag, not with a man in a uniform standing on a beach and declaring possession of something he did not own and could not possibly understand. Let us start with the deep time of this place, because that is where the truth of it lives. The Australian continent is, by the reckoning of most geologists, one of the oldest stable landmasses on the surface of the Earth. Parts of its rock formation go back more than 3 billion years. The Pilbara region of Western Australia contains some of the most ancient exposed rock anywhere on the planet. The continent has been sitting roughly in its current shape, drifting very slowly northward for an almost incomprehensible span of geological time. And for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer, human beings have lived on it. This is not a figure that most people carry around with them when they walk through Sydney. 65,000 years. For context, the oldest known permanent human settlements in Europe date to perhaps 40,000 years ago. The earliest anatomically modern humans in Britain arrived around 45,000 years ago, and were then mostly wiped out by a glacial advance, with the modern British population descending from a later wave of arrivals. Agriculture, the thing we tend to think of as the foundation of civilization, was developed independently in various parts of the world, starting around 12,000 years ago. Writing was invented around 5,000 years ago. The Roman Empire rose and fell in a window of roughly 500 years. The people who occupied the Sydney Basin were here for 65,000 years, perhaps more. The uncertainty is not because the evidence is thin. It is partly because the evidence keeps pushing the dates back further, and partly because the methods for dating very ancient organic material have real limits. What is not in doubt is that the occupation of this land is genuinely ancient in the deepest possible sense. So who were these families? Who were the specific people who owned the harbours and the sandstone ridges and the river mouths and the open bushland and the coastal headlands of the Sydney region before any other power arrived to contest the claim? The answer is both more specific and more complicated than most people expect. Because there were not one people, there were many. The Sydney region, at the time of first European contact, was home to a network of clan groups, each with its own name, its own territorial boundaries, its own internal leadership structures, its own specific knowledge of a particular stretch of country. These groups were not isolated from each other. They were connected by kinship, by ceremony, by trade, by systems of alliance and obligation that had been maintained and refined over thousands of years. But they were also distinct. They were not interchangeable. They had identities as specific and as fiercely maintained as any nation-state in the modern world. The names of these groups are not well known in mainstream Australian history. Some are not well known even to most people who grew up in Sydney, but they are recoverable. They are documented, imperfectly, and through the distorting lens of early colonial records, but enough survives to reconstruct at least the broad outlines of who was here and how they lived and how they understood their own place in the world. The Cadigal, the Wungal, the Camaragal, the Gadigal, sometimes written differently across different sources, the Wallamadigal, the Birrabirragal, the Borragigal, the Gwegal. These are some of the names. Each corresponds to a group with a specific territory, a specific relationship to the particular stretch of land and water they inhabited, a specific set of stories that encoded their knowledge of that territory in forms that could be transmitted across generations without the need for any written document. Let us begin with the Cadigal, because their territory occupied land that would later become the central core of the colonial settlement, the area we now call Sydney Cove, and the surrounding ridges and bays. The Cadigal people were a coastal group whose country ran roughly from the southern shores of Port Jackson, which is the formal name for the harbour, down through what is now the inner south and inner east of the city. They were fisher people primarily, extraordinarily skilled at harvesting the extraordinary abundance of the harbour and the coastal waters to the south. Their technology for doing this was not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. It was specific, refined, adapted to the exact conditions of this particular body of water over an enormous span of time. The bark canoes they used, which early European observers called Nawi, were not the dugout canoes of the Pacific Islands or the large ocean-going vessels of Polynesian cultures. They were something different, built for the particular demands of navigating the complex, sheltered waterways of Port Jackson and the surrounding bays and rivers. Made from a single piece of bark, formed by heat and held in shape by wooden spreaders, they were extraordinarily light and maneuverable. They were steered and propelled by a single paddle, or in some accounts by poles pushed against the harbour bottom in shallower areas. Women were often the primary operators of these canoes, managing both the vessel and the fishing lines, while small fires burned in clay hearths set into the floor of the canoe, used both for warmth and for cooking fish immediately on catching them. This image of a woman in a bark canoe on a harbour that is now lined with some of the most expensive real estate on earth, paddling slowly and fishing with extraordinary patience and skill, a small fire burning at her feet, is one of the images that does not appear in the tourist brochures of Sydney. It should. It is an image of genius. It is an image of a technology so perfectly matched to its environment that it needed almost no modification across thousands of years. The Wungal people occupied the territory on the southern banks of the Parramatta River, the river that flows westward from the harbour into the interior of the basin. Their country extended roughly through what is now Drummoyne, Canada Bay, and the surrounding inner west suburbs. The Parramatta River was not merely a geographic boundary for them. It was a road, a food source, a ceremonial landscape, and a living part of their identity. The river itself had a name that predated European contact, a name that has mostly been lost, though fragments survive in certain community records and in the work of linguists who spent generations trying to recover what could be recovered. The Camaragal occupied the northern shores of the harbour, the land that runs through what is now Camaray, Mossman, Cremorne, and the surrounding areas of the lower North Shore. They were described by early European observers as more numerous and apparently more powerful than some of the southern harbour groups, though this assessment needs to be read carefully because it was made by people who had almost no understanding of the social and political structures they were observing. What is clear is that the northern shores of the harbour represented a distinct territory with its own governance and its own deep relationship with the land. The Gwegal were the people of Botany Bay, the bay to the south of the harbour where James Cook first landed in 1770, 18 years before the permanent settlement at Sydney Cove. Their territory was specific to the shores of that bay and the surrounding coastal country. And it was the Gwegal who had the first documented encounter with Cook's expedition, an encounter that has been written into Australian history as a kind of neutral geographic event, a landing, an observation, a departure, when in fact it was something far more consequential and far more violent. 2 men were speared by Cook's party. This is in the historical record. It is not often the first thing mentioned in accounts of Cook's landing at Botany Bay. One of those men was later identified in some records as Kuman. His name survives in the record precisely because it was written down, which means it was registered in the colonial consciousness even if it was then largely forgotten. The other man's name is harder to recover. But both of them were real people, defending their territory, which is exactly what any rational person would do when strangers with incomprehensible weapons arrived on the shore of their country without invitation or warning. This pattern, the brief registration of an Indigenous name or identity, followed by its almost complete erasure from the continuing story, is one of the defining features of how Sydney's true history has been managed. Names appear, and then they disappear again, either because the person died, or because they were absorbed into the colonial record in a way that stripped context from them, or simply because nobody thought their continued presence in the historical narrative was important enough to maintain. Let us spend some time with what we actually know about the governance and social structure of the Sydney clans, because this is perhaps the most consistently misrepresented aspect of their history. The tendency in colonial-era accounts, and in the popular history that descended from those accounts, was to describe the Aboriginal people of the Sydney region as wanderers, as people without fixed territories or formal social organisation, as people who had not, in the language of 18th century European political philosophy, made productive use of the land and therefore had not established ownership of it in any legally or morally meaningful sense. This was not an honest assessment, it was a justification. The clans of the Sydney region were not wanderers. They had extremely specific and well-defined territorial boundaries. These boundaries were not marked with fences or walls or stone monuments in the European style, but they were precisely known and rigorously maintained through oral tradition, through ceremony, and through the practical consequences that followed from crossing them without appropriate permission. Every ridge, every bay, every river bend, every particular stand of trees or rocky outcrop had a name, a story attached to it, and often a specific protocol that governed who could use it and under what circumstances. The waterways were managed with particular sophistication. Fishing grounds were not simply available to anyone who showed up with a line. They were governed by complex systems that regulated access, that identified which groups had primary rights to which stretches of water, and that managed the fish populations in ways that maintained abundance over the long term. The harbour we now call Port Jackson was not simply a body of water. It was a managed resource, understood in extraordinary detail by the people who had been working it for thousands of years. The land above the waterline was similarly understood. The sandstone ridgelines of the Sydney Basin, the coastal heath, the pockets of forest in the sheltered gullies, the open woodland on the clay soils to the west, all of these different ecological zones were known and used in specific ways by specific groups. The movement of people across the landscape was not random. It followed seasonal patterns, ceremonial schedules, and the logic of sustainable land management. Fire was used as a deliberate tool to manage vegetation, to encourage new growth that would attract game, to maintain the open woodland character of much of the inland country. The fact that early European settlers described a landscape that looked like a park, like managed country, was not a coincidence. It was a park. It had been gardened and managed for thousands of years by people who understood it in ways the settlers could not have begun to appreciate. The political structure of the Sydney clans was not a simple hierarchy. There was no single chief who commanded the whole region in the way a European king commanded a kingdom. Authority was distributed, contextual, and based on specific kinds of knowledge and specific relationships, rather than on inherited position alone. Elder men and women held authority in domains where their knowledge and experience were recognized. Decisions about ceremonial matters followed different lines of authority than decisions about territorial access or about relationships with neighboring groups. The system was complex because it had to be. It had to manage the relationships between many different groups across a varied and sometimes challenging landscape, and it had to do so without any of the centralized administrative apparatus that European governance assumed to be necessary. This complexity was invisible to most European observers, partly because they were not looking for it, and partly because the tools they would have needed to recognize it, namely fluency in the relevant languages and sustained, respectful engagement with the communities over a long period of time, were almost entirely absent in the early colonial period. There were exceptions. There were individuals who did develop genuine knowledge and genuine relationships, but they were rare, and their accounts were often marginalized or disbelieved by the administrative mainstream. One of the most consequential misunderstandings, and one of the most consequential deliberate distortions, concerned the question of land ownership itself. The legal doctrine invoked to justify the British claim to the Australian continent was terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning empty land, or land belonging to no one. Under international law, as understood in the 18th century, the doctrine held that land occupied by people without recognizable systems of law or governance could be claimed by a colonizing power as if it were unoccupied. The British applied this doctrine to the entire Australian continent, essentially declaring that because Aboriginal Australians did not have the specific forms of land use and governance that European legal theory recognized, they had no rights to the land at all. This was known to be false at the time. There were people who said clearly and on the record that the land was occupied, that the inhabitants had their own social and legal systems, and that the claim of terra nullius was legally and morally unsustainable. They were ignored. The doctrine served too many powerful interests to be discarded on the grounds of accuracy. Terra nullius was not formally repudiated in Australian law until 1992, when the High Court of Australia delivered its decision in the case known as Mabo, a decision that acknowledged for the first time in formal Australian jurisprudence that the Indigenous peoples of Australia had held rights to their land prior to European colonisation, and that those rights had not simply been extinguished by the act of colonisation. The case had been brought by Eddie Mabo, a man from Mer Island in the Torres Strait, who had spent years fighting through the legal system to establish what he and his community had always known to be true, that his family and his people had owned their land for generations beyond counting, and that no legal fiction invented in London in the 18th century could make that ownership disappear. But we are moving ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the harbour. Let us go back to the specific people and the specific families who were there before anyone else, because their stories deserve to be told in detail, not just gestured at. The name Bennelong is probably the most well-known Indigenous name from early colonial Sydney. He appears in the history books. He is mentioned in the official record. There is a point of land in the harbour, the land on which the Sydney Opera House now stands, that carries the name Bennelong Point. This is not nothing. It is an acknowledgement of a kind. But the way Bennelong is usually presented, as a kind of bridge figure, a man who moved between Aboriginal and European worlds, who learned English and wore English clothes, and was taken to England by Governor Phillip, is a presentation that strips him of the complexity and the tragedy and the political significance of his actual story. Bennelong was Wangal. He was born sometime around 1764, which would make him in his mid-20s at the time of the First Fleet's arrival. He was not a random individual plucked by fate from the crowd. He was a man of status in his community. He had knowledge, connections, and a position within the social structure of the harbour clans that made him a significant figure, independent of any contact with Europeans. He had wives, he had alliances, he had, by the time the British arrived, already lived a full and significant life within the world of the Sydney clans. The way Bennelong came into sustained contact with the British was through what can only be described as a kidnapping. In November 1789, Governor Arthur Phillip ordered the capture of 2 Aboriginal men with the stated purpose of establishing communication and gaining information about the country. One of the men captured on that occasion was Bennelong. The other was a man named Colby. Colby escaped after a few days. Bennelong was held for a longer period, and during that time, he learned enough English to establish a form of communication with Phillip and the colonial administration. Eventually, he was released or escaped and returned to his community. But the relationship continued. He maintained contact with the settlement. He brought the British into the social world of the harbour clans in ways that were both strategic on his part and ultimately disastrous for his people. Phillip took Bennelong to England in 1792. This was partly symbolic, partly an expression of the governor's genuine, if paternalistic, interest in his Aboriginal companion, and partly a piece of political theatre designed to demonstrate to British audiences that the colonisation of New South Wales was proceeding in a relatively civilised fashion. Bennelong spent nearly 3 years in England. He met King George III. He was presented at court, his portrait was painted, and then he came home. What he came home to was a world that was already irrevocably changed. The smallpox epidemic that had swept through the harbour clans in 1789, just a year after the First Fleet's arrival, had killed a catastrophic proportion of the population. Estimates vary, but the mortality rate in some communities may have been above half. The families who had managed the harbour for thousands of years had been reduced within a single year to a fraction of their former numbers. The knowledge they carried, the stories, the ceremonial responsibilities, the detailed understanding of the landscape that had been maintained and refined across generations, all of that was at risk of being lost, simply because the people who held it were dying. The smallpox epidemic is one of the most devastating and least discussed events in Australian history. It did not arrive by accident, though it is sometimes presented as if it did, as if smallpox was simply a natural consequence of contact, a tragedy without agency or culpability. But the British colonists who arrived in 1788 carried with them, in their medicine chests, samples of variola, the smallpox virus, preserved in material that was used as part of the inoculation practice of the period. The question of whether smallpox was deliberately introduced into the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region has been debated by historians for decades. And while no definitive proof of deliberate biological warfare has been established, the circumstantial evidence has given many historians serious pause. What is certain is that the epidemic occurred, that it was devastating, and that the colonial administration did very little to assist the people who were dying. Bennelong returned to this diminished world. He was a man caught between 2 social systems, neither of which could fully accommodate him. Within his own community, his extended time with the British, and his apparent accommodation with the colonial presence had complicated his relationships and his standing. Within the British colonial world, he was valued as a curiosity, as a demonstration that Aboriginal people could learn English manners and customs, but he was never treated as an equal, and never given the kind of sustained respect or material support that might have allowed him to maintain his position. He died in 1813, somewhere in his late 40s. The accounts of his later years suggest a man in significant distress, in poor health, drinking heavily, caught in a kind of social limbo that had no comfortable resolution. He was buried at what is now Kissing Point in Ryde, a suburb on the upper Parramatta River. His grave is not marked in any prominent way. The point of land that carries his name in the harbour is covered by one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Sydney Opera House, which was built without any formal acknowledgement of whose country the land occupied, and which stands on ground that was a significant meeting place and ceremonial site for the harbour clans long before any European arrived. Colby's story runs differently, and it is in some ways even more instructive. Colby was probably Cadigal, one of the people whose country occupied the southern shores of the harbour. After his escape from British captivity in 1789, he maintained a more complex and in some ways more active relationship with the colonial administration than Bennelong did. He served as an intermediary, a guide, and at various points a political operator within the changing world of the harbour clans. He appears in the records as a man who understood very clearly that the world was changing around him and who was trying to navigate that change in ways that would protect his community as much as possible. One of the most striking moments in Colby's documented history is his involvement in the events surrounding the hanging of two Aboriginal men in 1816. These executions were part of a broader campaign of terror ordered by Governor Lachlan Macquarie in response to a series of violent clashes in the inland country west of Sydney. Macquarie's orders authorised the killing of Aboriginal men found in groups of 6 or more in certain areas, the capture of women and children, and a general military campaign against Aboriginal communities that historians have since described as a massacre, the Appin Massacre of 1816 being the most thoroughly documented component of it. The hangings that followed were intended as a public demonstration of the consequences of resistance, and Colby was among those compelled to witness them. The Appin Massacre is worth pausing on because it represents one of the clearest examples of how the erasure of the Sydney families was not simply a matter of neglect or misunderstanding, but of active violence. Governor Macquarie, who is celebrated in mainstream Australian history as a relatively enlightened administrator, a man who built roads and public buildings and brought a degree of order to the young colony, also authorised a military campaign that resulted in the deaths of at least 14 Darawal people, including women and children, many of whom were driven or chased over a cliff in the darkness before dawn at a place on Broughton Pass, a site in the highlands southwest of Sydney. The soldiers had been ordered to kill, and they did. The Darawal were another of the great families of the Greater Sydney region. Their country extended south and southwest from the harbour, through the Sutherland Shire, through the Illawarra, and into the highlands. They were a distinct people from the harbour Eora clans, with their own language and their own territorial relationships, but they were part of the same broader web of connection that covered the entire Sydney Basin and its surrounds. The Darawal had been resisting the expansion of colonial settlement into their country with increasing urgency through the first decades of the 19th century, because that expansion was destroying the food sources, the water sources, and the ceremonial landscapes on which their survival depended. The Appin Massacre ended, in practical terms, the capacity of the Darawal to maintain organised resistance to the colonial expansion in their country. Those who survived scattered. Some attached themselves to the fringes of colonial settlements. Some moved further into the highlands. Some disappeared from the historical record entirely. The governor ordered that the bodies of the killed men be beheaded and their heads taken to Sydney for display. This order appears to have been partially carried out. It was intended as a message. It was also a desecration of the dead in a cultural context, where the treatment of the deceased was a matter of profound ceremonial significance. Now let us turn to something that sits behind all of these individual stories. Because the stories of Bennelong and Colby and the Darawal and the Cadigal and all the other harbour clans are not just stories of tragedy, though they are that. They are also stories of extraordinary persistence, of knowledge that survived against extraordinary odds, and of a relationship to country that was deep enough and resilient enough to endure even when the social structures that had maintained it for thousands of years were being dismantled around the edges. The concept of country, in the sense that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia use the term, is not simply a geographic designation. It does not merely mean the land that a group occupies or inhabits. Country is a living relationship. Country includes the land and the water and the air and the plants and the animals and the minerals and the weather systems and the seasonal cycles and the spiritual dimensions that the Western analytical tradition tends to keep separate from the physical world. To be of a country, in this understanding, is not merely to live in a place. It is to be responsible for it, to be obligated to it, to know it in a way that encompasses both the practical and the cosmological. The knowledge of country that the harbour clans possessed was not simply information. It was not a collection of facts that could be stored in a database and retrieved as needed. It was embedded in ceremony, in story, in the patterns of movement across the landscape, in the skills of fishing and fire management and plant identification and water finding that were passed from generation to generation through participation and observation rather than through instruction in any formal sense. To lose a generation to smallpox was not merely to lose a demographic cohort. It was to lose irreplaceable segments of an accumulated knowledge base that had been developed and refined over a timescale that dwarfs any comparable tradition in the Western world. The stories that carried this knowledge were organized in ways that modern scholars have only recently begun to appreciate. The concept of the songlines, which is the term most commonly used in English to describe the network of narratives that mapped the Australian landscape for its Aboriginal custodians, is a concept that has been popularized in recent years, partly through the work of writers like Bruce Chatwin and partly through the increasing visibility of Aboriginal cultural voices in mainstream Australian discourse. But the songlines of the Sydney region, the specific narrative networks that encoded the knowledge of the harbour country, are among the least well documented of any in Australia, precisely because the communities that held them were so severely affected by early colonial contact. Some fragments remain. The oral traditions that survived, often held in the memories of individuals who passed them on quietly and carefully through the 19th and 20th centuries, have been supplemented by the work of linguists and anthropologists who recorded what they could at various points in that period. The Darawal language has been the subject of significant recovery work in recent decades. The language of the coastal Eora clans, often referred to as Cadigal or Sydney language, has similarly been the subject of reconstruction efforts, drawing on the early word lists compiled by colonial observers like Governor Phillip's secretary David Collins, by the naturalist John White, and by Watkin Tench, whose accounts of the early contact period remain some of the most detailed and in some ways most honest documents of that time. Watkin Tench was a Marine officer who arrived with the First Fleet and who spent 4 years in the colony before returning to England. His accounts, a narrative of the expedition to Botany Bay and a complete account of the settlement at Port Jackson, are remarkable documents, partly for their literary quality and partly for the genuine curiosity and relative openness with which he describes the Aboriginal people he encountered. He is not free of the assumptions of his time and his culture, and his accounts have to be read with care. But he observed carefully, recorded what he saw with reasonable accuracy, and occasionally allowed himself to express genuine admiration for the people he was meeting, as well as something approaching recognition of the injustice being visited upon them. Tench describes, for instance, the grief and rage of Aboriginal people who had lost family to smallpox, documenting an encounter with a man who had lost his wife and children and who expressed his anguish in terms that Tench clearly found deeply affecting. He describes the sophistication of Aboriginal fishing techniques, the complexity of the social relationships he observed, the evident intelligence and resourcefulness of the individuals he came to know. He also describes, with less self-awareness, the various ways in which the colonial administration undermined, ignored, or actively harmed the people it was supposedly attempting to civilize. David Collins, another early colonial observer, compiled one of the most extensive early records of the Sydney language, the word lists and grammatical observations that now form a significant part of the corpus used in language reconstruction work. Collins was not a linguist in any trained sense. and his recording is imperfect, but the effort he put into documenting the language suggests at least some recognition that there was something worth recording. This recognition did not translate, in his case, or in the case of most colonial administrators of the period, into any meaningful respect for the people whose language it was, or for their rights to the land on which they spoke it. The physical landscape of the Sydney Basin is itself a kind of archive of the deep history we are exploring. The sandstone ridges and headlands that give Sydney its distinctive character are not merely geological features. They are inscribed with evidence of human presence and human culture that extends back across the entire span of Aboriginal occupation. Rock engravings, the carved images of fish and whales and human figures and geometric patterns that appear on the flat sandstone surfaces throughout the national parks and bushland reserves of Greater Sydney are some of the most significant and most undervalued cultural monuments in Australia. The engravings are found throughout the Sydney Basin, from the northern beaches and the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park in the north, to the Royal National Park in the south, to the Blue Mountains in the west. They occur in concentrations and in isolation, on prominent ridgelines with sweeping views and in hidden gullies. Some are clearly visible and have been documented and partially protected. Many more almost certainly remain undiscovered or undocumented, on private land, in areas of regrowth bush, in locations where nobody has yet looked systematically. The images carved into the sandstone include representations of animals that are still present in the Sydney region, kangaroos and wallabies and echidnas and goannas and various birds, as well as representations of animals that are no longer present in the coastal areas, including large macropods that suggest some of the engravings may predate the extensive clearing of the landscape. There are images of fish, including species that are specifically associated with the harbour and the coastal waters, whiting and snapper and bream and the large rays that still occasionally appear in the shallower bays. There are images of whales, which were a significant resource and a significant ceremonial presence for the coastal clans. There are human figures, sometimes in postures that suggest ceremony or combat, sometimes simply standing or running. And there are abstract forms, circles and lines and grids, and more complex geometric patterns whose meanings are not fully understood. These engravings are not random decorations. They are not the equivalent of graffiti. They are cultural documents of enormous significance, representing accumulated knowledge and accumulated meaning that was deposited on the landscape over an enormous span of time by people who understood this landscape in ways that we have barely begun to appreciate. They were maintained. Certain engravings show evidence of having been recut and redeepened over time, a process of maintenance that implies ongoing ceremonial use over generations and probably centuries. This is not the behavior of people who do not own their land. This is the behavior of people who have owned it, in the deepest possible sense, for a very long time. The whale engravings are particularly worth dwelling on. The Sydney coast and the harbour entrances were part of the seasonal pathway of humpback whales migrating between their feeding grounds in Antarctic waters and their breeding grounds in the warmer waters further north. This migration was not merely a natural spectacle for the harbour clans. It was a resource, a ceremonial marker, and a subject of deep cosmological significance. Stranded whales were major communal events. A whale beached on the shore would bring people from across the region together for a feast and a ceremony that could last for days. The distribution of the meat from a stranded whale followed specific protocols that reinforced social relationships and obligations. The whale was not simply food. It was an event that mobilized and expressed the social structure of the entire regional community. This social mobilization around significant resources is one of the things that most clearly distinguishes the social organization of the Sydney clans from the popular stereotype of isolated, wandering bands surviving at the edge of subsistence. The harbour clans were not in subsistence mode. They were managing an extraordinarily rich and productive landscape that provided them with abundant food across all seasons. The harbour alone, before the pollution and the dredging and the fishing pressure of the colonial and modern periods, was so productive that it could feed large numbers of people with relatively modest effort. Archaeological evidence from shell middens, the accumulations of discarded shells and other food waste that mark the sites of Aboriginal camps around the harbour and the coast, indicates that the productivity of the water was sustained and managed over very long periods, with no evidence of the kind of resource depletion that tends to accompany unmanaged exploitation. The middens are themselves significant archives. They are found all around the harbour and the coast, in sheltered bays, on headlands, in the mouths of gullies and creek valleys. They record the food habits and the presence of people across periods that can, in some cases, be dated to many thousands of years before the present. They tell us which species were being harvested, in what quantities, over what periods. They tell us about the seasonal use of different parts of the landscape, and they tell us that the people who lived here were not at the margins. They were prosperous, well-fed, and managing their resources with skill and care. The Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, on the northern outskirts of metropolitan Sydney, contains one of the richest concentrations of Aboriginal engravings anywhere in Australia, with more than 500 individual engraving sites documented within the park boundaries, and more continuing to be found. The park takes its name from the Ku-ring-gai people, the group whose country occupied the northern fringes of the harbour and the land that extends up the coast to Broken Bay and the Hawkesbury River. The Ku-ring-gai are also sometimes referred to in older sources as the Ku-ring-gai or Kamaragal. They are among the groups whose names are most clearly preserved in the place names of the Greater Sydney region, even if the connection is not always made explicit in everyday usage. Narrabeen, the Northern Beaches suburb, preserves in its name a version of a word from the local language. Manly, the famous Ocean Beach suburb on the north head of the harbour, takes its English name from a comment Governor Phillip made about the confident bearing of the Aboriginal men he met there in 1788, but the land itself had a name before the English one arrived. Narraweena, Collaroy, Woolloomulu, Parramatta, Tuongabi, Cabramatta, Kogarah, Kiama, Yowie Bay. The landscape of Greater Sydney is covered in names that are remnants of the languages of the families who held this country before any other power arrived. This is sometimes acknowledged in a casual way, a brief note that a suburb name comes from an Aboriginal word, without any deeper engagement with what that means, or with the people from whom those words came. But the names themselves are a record. They are the ghost of a sovereignty that was never formally surrendered. The question of sovereignty is perhaps the most legally and politically charged aspect of the history we are exploring, because the families who owned Sydney before anyone else did not, at the point of European arrival, cede their country by treaty or by formal agreement of any kind. There was no Waitangi here, no formal negotiation, no instrument by which the Aboriginal peoples of the Sydney region consented to British sovereignty over their land. There was not even the fig leaf of purchase, the kind of transaction, however exploitative, that the Dutch, for instance, engaged in when they bought Manhattan from the Lenape for a collection of trade goods. There was simply assertion. Britain declared sovereignty, and then Britain enforced that declaration through violence, through disease, through the systematic destruction of the economic and social foundations on which Aboriginal life depended, and through the apparatus of colonial law that rendered Aboriginal people legally invisible within the very territory their families had managed for millennia. The families who owned Sydney were not simply displaced from it. They were subjected to a process that historian Patrick Wolfe described as the logic of elimination, the systematic effort not merely to defeat or even to expel a competing population, but to destroy the conditions under which that population could continue to exist as a distinct people with a distinct claim to place. This logic operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. It operated through direct violence, through dispossession of land, through the destruction of food sources, through the disruption of kinship and ceremonial systems, through the removal of children from their families, through the suppression of language and culture, and through the construction of a historical narrative that denied the depth and the legitimacy of Aboriginal connection to country. The removal of children is a chapter of this history that is now widely acknowledged in Australia, at least in its broad outlines. Since the Bringing Them Home report of 1997 and the formal government apology of 2008, the policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families, often under the justification that they were being rescued from deprivation or brought into the benefits of civilization, operated across Australia throughout the late 19th and much of the 20th century. In New South Wales, the legislative framework for this removal was provided by the Aborigines Protection Act of 1909 and its various subsequent amendments. The Aborigines Protection Board, which administered the policy, had the power to remove Aboriginal children from their families without judicial oversight, without parental consent, and without any formal finding of neglect or abuse. The children removed under this policy were placed in institutions or with non-Aboriginal families, denied contact with their parents, their communities, and their languages, and in many cases never returned to their families at all. The generations affected by these removals are now sometimes referred to as the stolen generations, a term that acknowledges both the scale and the systematic nature of what occurred. The effects of these removals are not merely historical. They ripple through the present in the form of disrupted family structures, lost language and cultural knowledge, intergenerational trauma, and the specific legal and bureaucratic challenges faced by communities trying to reconstruct their histories and their identities from fragmentary and often actively suppressed records. But here we need to do something that popular history often fails to do, which is to resist the narrative that frames the Sydney families purely as victims. Because that framing, while it captures something true, also erases another dimension of the story, which is the extraordinary resilience, creativity, and determination with which Aboriginal people resisted, adapted, survived, and in many cases maintained the core of their cultural and spiritual identity through an assault that was designed precisely to prevent them from doing so. There were resistors. There were people who fought back, sometimes with spears and sometimes with words, sometimes with the careful maintenance of knowledge that the colonial system could not see or did not know to look for, and sometimes with legal and political strategies that anticipated by generations the formal recognition of Indigenous rights that came much later. Pemulwuy is the name that stands most prominently in the history of Aboriginal resistance in the Sydney region. He was a Bidjigal man, from the Bidjigal clan whose country lay in the hills and bushland to the west of the harbour, in the area we now call the Western Suburbs and the Hills District. Pemulwuy was not a harbour person in the sense that the Cadigal or the Wangal were, but he operated across a wide territory and maintained connections with multiple clan groups in the region. Pemulwuy first comes into the documentary record in 1790, when he is identified as having killed John McIntyre, a gamekeeper employed by Governor Phillip. McIntyre had a reputation among the Aboriginal community for cruelty, and his death, while it represented a significant escalation in the tensions between the colony and the surrounding clans, needs to be understood in the context of the systematic harm that colonial expansion was already visiting on Aboriginal communities. Pemulwuy was speared in the incident that followed, but he survived. Over the following decade, Pemulwuy organized and led a series of raids on colonial farms and settlements in the Parramatta and George River areas, representing a sustained campaign of resistance to the expansion of settlement into Aboriginal country. He was shot multiple times and repeatedly reported to be dead or dying, but kept reappearing, kept leading resistance, kept surviving through a combination of his own resilience and, in Aboriginal oral tradition, through spiritual protection that made him resistant to the weapons of the settlers. Governor Hunter placed a bounty on him in 1797. He was never captured. He was eventually shot by an unknown person in 1802, and his head was sent to England, to Sir Joseph Banks, the botanist who had accompanied Cook on the first voyage and who had a significant personal and institutional investment in the colonial project. This detail, the decapitation and the sending of Pemulwuy's head to England as a kind of trophy, is one of the most telling and most disturbing moments in the early colonial history of Sydney. It says something very specific about how the colonial administration perceived the conflict and how it perceived the man it had spent years trying to kill. Pemulwuy's resistance is now acknowledged in various ways in the public history of Sydney, including a memorial in Parramatta and the use of his name in various forms of commemoration. But the acknowledgement tends to present him as a solitary hero, a remarkable individual, without fully engaging with the broader context of community resistance and the broader political significance of what he was doing. He was not simply a bandit or a troublemaker. He was a leader defending his people and his country against an invasion, and the campaign he conducted was strategically coherent and maintained at considerable personal cost for more than a decade. His son Tedbury continued the resistance after his father's death, and other figures in other parts of the Greater Sydney region pursued their own forms of opposition to colonial expansion. The picture that emerges when you look across the entire period of early colonial contact with the Sydney clans is not of passive people simply swept away by an irresistible force. It is of communities that were fighting for their survival and their sovereignty against a colonial system that had both the advantages of numbers and arms on its side and the willingness to use them without restraint. The loss was enormous. By the middle of the 19th century, the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region had been reduced from its pre-contact level, which estimates suggest was in the thousands, to a small fraction of that. The communities that survived were scattered, often living on the margins of colonial settlements, in conditions of poverty and social disruption that were themselves products of the dispossession. The ceremonies that had structured social life, the elaborate ceremonial gatherings that had brought people together from across the region to initiate young men, to manage relationships between clans, to perform the rituals that maintained the connection between the living community and its country, these gatherings had become difficult or impossible to conduct, as the land on which they would have been held was cleared and settled. But the communities did not disappear. This is the fact that the popular historical narrative tends to obscure, perhaps unintentionally, but sometimes not. The descendants of the Cadigal, the Wangal, the Camaragal, the Gwegal, the Darawal, the Bidjigal, the Guringai, and all the other clans of the Greater Sydney region are present in the city today. They live in Sydney. Their children go to Sydney schools. They work in Sydney, they vote in Sydney elections, they pay Sydney rates. And they maintain, with varying degrees of continuity and disruption, the connection to country that is the core of their identity. The La Perouse community, on the shores of Botany Bay, represents perhaps the most visible and best documented example of continuity in the Greater Sydney region. The land at La Perouse was set aside as a reserve for Aboriginal people in 1882, and a community has maintained a presence there more or less continuously since then. The people of La Perouse are primarily Bidjigal and Gwegal in their ancestry, though the community has grown to include people from many other Aboriginal backgrounds as well. They maintained through the worst periods of the protection era a community life that preserved elements of cultural knowledge, language, memory, and ceremonial practice that might otherwise have been entirely lost. The La Perouse community was visited by a number of researchers and collectors in the early and mid-20th century, whose work, though it reflected the problematic assumptions of its time, nonetheless preserved significant amounts of information that has subsequently been used in cultural and linguistic recovery. The records of these visits, including recordings of songs, stories, and language, are now held in various archives and are being returned to and worked with by community members and researchers engaged in language and cultural revitalization. Language revitalization is perhaps the most concrete and most moving form of cultural recovery currently underway in the Sydney region. The Darawal language is being taught to children in schools in the communities of southwestern Sydney. Cadigal language materials are being used in educational settings around the harbour. Words and phrases from the languages of the Sydney clans are appearing in public signage, in the names of new developments, in the acknowledgements of country that now begin most public events in Australia. These are small steps, and they do not undo the enormous harm that was done. But they represent something genuine, a refusal to accept that the erasure was final or complete. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, The document, produced in 2017 by a gathering of Indigenous representatives from across Australia at the base of Uluru in Central Australia, called for a voice to Parliament, a treaty process, and what it called truth, the formal acknowledgement and documentation of the full history of the relationship between the Australian state and its Indigenous peoples. The statement was addressed to all Australians, and it used language of extraordinary dignity and restraint. It described the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a torment, and it called for healing through genuine engagement rather than continued bureaucratic management. The Voice referendum of 2023 resulted in a defeat for the proposal, with a majority of Australian voters declining to support the constitutional enshrinement of an Indigenous advisory body. The reasons for that defeat are complex and disputed, and this is not the place to rehearse them in detail. But the result was experienced by many Aboriginal Australians, including many in the greater Sydney community, as a continuation of a pattern of exclusion that has characterised their relationship with the Australian political system since colonisation began. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are still being asked to justify their presence in the national conversation about their own country. There is a place in Sydney where some of this history is concentrated in a way that is almost unbearable to contemplate if you know what you are looking at. It is at Barangaroo, on the western edge of the CBD, on the shores of Darling Harbour. The name Barangaroo is the name of one of the most significant Aboriginal women in the early colonial record of Sydney. She was Camaragal, a woman of the northern harbour shores, and she was the wife of Bennelong. She is documented in the early colonial sources as a woman of fierce temperament, strong opinions, and considerable courage. She refused to adopt European clothes when other Aboriginal people in regular contact with the settlement did so. She made her views known, through Bennelong's translation, to Governor Phillip himself. She was not a passive figure. She was a political actor in her own right. Barangaroo died in 1791, probably in her 30s. Her death came at a particularly difficult moment for the harbour communities, just a few years after the smallpox epidemic had devastated the population. She was buried at Farm Cove, the cove on the eastern side of the settlement that is now the Royal Botanic Garden. Governor Phillip attended her burial, which is a measure of the respect, or at least the acknowledgement, that she commanded. The area on the western waterfront that now carries her name was developed in the second decade of the 21st century as one of the largest urban renewal projects in Australian history. The development includes luxury residential towers, a casino, a hotel, and a public foreshore precinct that is presented as a gift to the city. The use of the name Barangaroo for this development was contested by Aboriginal communities from the beginning, on the grounds that attaching an Aboriginal name to a major commercial project without genuine Aboriginal participation in or benefit from that project was a form of appropriation, a way of invoking the connection to country without in any way honouring it. These concerns were expressed clearly and in the public record. They were largely ignored by the Development Authority and the state government. The foreshore precinct of Barangaroo does now include various acknowledgements of Aboriginal history, interpretive panels, artworks, the preservation of a small area of reconstructed sandstone foreshore that gives some sense of the character of the waterfront before the colonial period. These inclusions were the result of sustained advocacy by Aboriginal community members and their supporters, and they are not nothing. But they exist within a development that was fundamentally shaped by commercial imperatives, that displaced existing users of the waterfront, and that did not involve any formal process of consent or consultation with the descendants of the people whose name it carries. The pattern that Barangaroo represents, using the names and imagery of the original inhabitants of Sydney to add cultural richness or marketing appeal to projects that are primarily directed by and for non-Aboriginal interests, is pervasive throughout the city. It is not confined to property development. It appears in tourism, in public art, in government communications, in education, and it represents a continuation of the original problem, which is the conviction that Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal identity are resources available for use by the general society rather than expressions of a living sovereignty that deserves respect and material acknowledgement. What would genuine acknowledgement look like? This is a question that people ask in good faith and sometimes in bad faith, and it deserves a serious answer. It would look, at the minimum, like the formal legal acknowledgement that the land was never ceded and that the original owners retain rights to it, that the legal system is obligated to recognize and protect. It would look like the systematic and well-resourced support for language and cultural revitalization, so that the knowledge systems developed over 65,000 years and then deliberately suppressed are given the best possible chance of recovery and continuation. It would look like the inclusion of Aboriginal people in the governance of the places that are their country, not as token consultees but as actual decision makers with genuine authority over the management of land and water that their families have been responsible for since before any of the rest of us arrived. It would look like the honest telling of the full history, including the massacres and the forced removals and the biological devastation of the smallpox epidemic in the public record and in the educational curriculum, so that Australians know what happened in their country and can engage with it as informed citizens rather than in comfortable ignorance. None of these things would be simple or cheap or uncontested, but none of them would require anything that has not already been done in various forms in other countries that are grappling honestly with their colonial histories. New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, the United States, all of these countries have done some of this work, imperfectly and incompletely, but sincerely and to some effect. Australia has begun the process. It has not yet committed to it fully. Let us go back to the harbour one more time. Let us go back to the early morning, before the ferries start running and before the tourists arrive, when the light is still thin and the water is quiet. Let us imagine standing at the end of one of the sandstone headlands that jut into the harbour, one of the points of rock that the clans of the harbour would have known as fishing spots and ceremonial places and navigational landmarks. The sandstone under your feet is the same sandstone that has been under human feet here for at least 65,000 years. The view across the water is not so different from the view that the Cadigal or the Camaragal or the Wangal would have had from this same point on a morning 65,000 years ago, or 40,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or 500 years ago. The harbour is still beautiful. The water is still extraordinarily blue when the light hits it right. The headlands are still dramatic in the morning light. What has changed is the human context in which this landscape exists. The people who owned it before anyone else are still here, but the system that surrounds them continues, in various ways large and small, to refuse to acknowledge fully what that means. The names that were erased are being recovered, slowly and against the ongoing friction of institutional inertia and public indifference. The knowledge systems that were suppressed are being revived, with enormous effort and at great personal cost, by communities that should not have to fight this hard just to maintain the right to their own identity. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else were the Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and the Gweagal and the Darawal and the Bidjigal and the Guringai and the many others whose names appear in the fragmentary records, in the oral traditions and in the place names and in the rock engravings and in the shell middens and in the stories, passed quietly through the generations under conditions that were designed to make such passing impossible. Their names were not erased completely. They were suppressed, neglected, overlooked, dismissed, and sometimes actively destroyed. But they survived. And they are being remembered now. This video is one small part of that remembering. The work being done by Aboriginal community members and their supporters in language revitalization, in cultural recovery, in legal advocacy, in the ongoing effort to rewrite the public history of this place in a way that acknowledges the full truth of it, that work is the larger part. The harbour has been here for a very long time. The people who first understood it have been here for a very long time. The story of how they were treated when others arrived is a dark one. But but the story of how they survived and maintained and continue to advocate for their rights and their place is a story of remarkable human endurance, and it deserves to be known. Now let us go deeper into the specific landscape of knowledge that the harbour clans maintained, because it is in the details of this knowledge that the full depth of the dispossession becomes most apparent. We talk in general terms about the loss of cultural knowledge, but it is worth trying to be specific about what that actually means in practice. What was known and how it was known, and what was lost and what survived. The harbour, in its pre-colonial state, was not simply a beautiful body of water. It was a complex ecological system that had been understood in extraordinary detail by people who depended on it for their subsistence. The species of fish present in the harbour and their seasonal movements, the tidal patterns and current systems that affected where fish would be at different times of day, the relationship between weather and wind and the behavior of fish at the surface, the specific fishing techniques appropriate for different species and different conditions, all of this was known in the kind of practical detail that only comes from long and close observation by people who are both intelligent and highly motivated to understand what they are observing. The knowledge of tides, for instance, was extraordinarily detailed. The tidal patterns of Port Jackson are complex because the harbour is a large drowned river valley with multiple arms and bays, and the tidal signal behaves differently in different parts of the system. The time of high water and the height of the tide vary across the harbour in ways that are not immediately obvious. The fish species that congregate in the shallows during certain tidal phases, the conditions under which rays were active in the sandy bays, the relationship between moon phase and the movement of certain species, all of this was part of the practical knowledge base of people who fished these waters daily and who had been refining their understanding of the system across generations. The plant knowledge was equally detailed. The sandstone landscape of the Sydney Basin, while it is often described as infertile, supports a remarkable diversity of plant species, many of which were used by the harbour clans for food, medicine, and material culture. The identification of edible plants, the knowledge of which parts were edible and at which stage of growth, the processing techniques required to remove toxins or improve digestibility, the seasonal timing of different plant foods, all of this was embedded in a knowledge system that was encoded in ceremony, story, and the observation-based learning that accompanied a child's growth within the community. Some of this plant knowledge has been recovered and is being actively used today. The community at La Perouse and other Aboriginal communities around Sydney are involved in projects that identify, protect, and in some cases cultivate the plant species that were important to their ancestors. Bush tucker is a term that has entered general Australian vocabulary, but its popularisation sometimes obscures the depth and specificity of the knowledge tradition it points toward. The ability to look at a particular plant in a particular setting and know not only that it is edible, but how to prepare it, when to harvest it, where it grows, in which seasons, and what its relationship is to the other plants and animals of its ecological community. This is the product of a knowledge tradition that took many thousands of years to develop, and that cannot simply be reconstituted from a general description or a recipe card. The astronomical knowledge of the Sydney clans is another dimension of the intellectual tradition that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Aboriginal Australians have one of the oldest and most sophisticated astronomical traditions on Earth, and the harbour clans were part of this broader tradition. The sky was not merely a backdrop or a source of light. It was a map, a calendar, a storehouse of information about seasonal cycles and ecological events. The Milky Way was read as a rich and complex text, with the dark patches created by interstellar dust forming a series of images, a constellation tradition that runs alongside and distinct from the star pattern constellations of the Western tradition. The emu in the sky, one of the best known of the dark constellation images, is visible in the Milky Way across the southern sky, and its position and orientation at different times of year signal the seasonal availability of emu eggs, a significant food resource. The rising and setting of various stars and planets were similarly encoded with ecological information. The appearance of certain stars or star clusters at particular positions in the sky mark the beginning or end of seasons, the expected appearance of certain fish species in the harbor, the timing of important plant foods. This is not a primitive form of observation. It is applied astronomy, the use of sophisticated astronomical knowledge in service of practical ecological management, developed and refined over a period that dwarfs the history of formal Western astronomy. Some of the engravings in the national parks around Sydney are thought to be connected to astronomical observation, with certain sites positioned and oriented in ways that suggest deliberate alignment with celestial events. The evidence for this is preliminary and contested in the academic literature, but it is being taken seriously by researchers who are approaching it with the rigor that the question deserves. The documentation of these potential alignments is proceeding slowly and carefully, in collaboration with Aboriginal community members who bring to the research the context and the cultural knowledge that the purely scientific approach cannot supply. The ceremonial system of the harbour clans, which coordinated the social and spiritual life of the regional community, was itself a form of governance. The major ceremonies, which required the gathering of people from multiple clan groups, were occasions not merely for spiritual observance, but for the management of relationships between groups, for the resolution of disputes, for the negotiation of marriages and alliances, for the transmission of esoteric knowledge from initiated adults to young people undergoing initiation. The ceremony was the mechanism through which the social fabric was maintained and renewed. The disruption of these ceremonies by colonial expansion was therefore not simply a cultural loss. It was the destruction of the governance system. When the land on which ceremonies would have been conducted was cleared for farms, when the people who would have conducted them were killed by disease or violence or dispersal, when the conditions that made ceremony possible were systematically removed, the result was the destruction not only of the spiritual tradition, but of the social and political institutions that had kept the community functioning as a coherent and self-governing entity for thousands of years. This is why the legal concept of native title, which was introduced into Australian law following the Mabo decision, is both more important and more limited than it might appear. Native title acknowledges that Aboriginal people retain rights to land, where they can demonstrate continuous connection to country through laws and customs. This is a genuine legal recognition of a genuine truth. But the requirement to demonstrate continuous connection places an enormous burden of proof on communities that were systematically disrupted by the colonial process, in ways that were often specifically designed to prevent the continuity that is now required for legal recognition. Communities that were forcibly removed from their land, whose ceremonies were prohibited, whose children were taken and raised in institutions, and whose elders were prevented from transmitting their knowledge, are now required to demonstrate the kind of continuous, unbroken connection to country that the colonial system spent a century trying to sever. The irony is as painful as it is precise. The Dharawal connection to the Royal National Park, the park that covers the coastal country south of Sydney and which is the second oldest national park in the world, is an instructive example of these dynamics. The park was established in 1879 on land that was Dharawal country, without any consultation with or compensation to the Dharawal people. For most of the park's subsequent history, Dharawal people have had to engage with it as members of the general public, subject to the same rules and the same limitations as any other visitor, in a landscape that their families managed and maintained for thousands of years. Formal recognition of Dharawal connections to the park has been slow and incomplete. The knowledge of the ecology that the Dharawal hold, the knowledge that would make them the most qualified managers of this landscape, has been largely set aside in favor of Western ecological management frameworks that are only now beginning to incorporate the insights of Indigenous land management. The incorporation of traditional burning practice into the management of Australian bushland is one of the most significant recent shifts in land management policy and one of the most significant formal acknowledgements of the depth of Aboriginal ecological knowledge. The catastrophic fires of 2019 and 2020, which burned across enormous areas of southeastern Australia, including large parts of the Greater Sydney region, focused public attention on the question of fire management in Australian landscapes in a way that nothing had previously managed to do. In the aftermath of those fires, the voices of Aboriginal land managers who had been arguing for decades that the suppression of traditional burning was making the landscape more vulnerable to catastrophic wildfire finally received the attention they deserved. Cultural burning, the practice of using low-intensity fire to maintain healthy country, to reduce fuel loads, to encourage the regeneration of particular plant species, and to maintain the mosaic of different vegetation types that supports biodiversity, is not a simple technique that can be picked up and applied without context. It is a knowledge system developed over thousands of years of close observation and refinement, and it requires an understanding of specific country, specific ecological communities, specific seasonal and climatic conditions that can only be acquired through long and sustained engagement with the land. Aboriginal land managers have this understanding. Non-Aboriginal land managers, however well trained in Western ecological science, are working from a much shallower knowledge base when it comes to the specific requirements of specific Australian landscapes. The recognition of this is growing, slowly and unevenly, across the institutions that manage Australian land. National parks and conservation agencies in several states have begun formal partnerships with Aboriginal communities and land managers, incorporating traditional knowledge into management planning and giving Aboriginal people meaningful roles in the management of their country. In some cases, formal Indigenous protected areas have been declared, giving Aboriginal communities direct management authority over significant areas of country. These are genuine advances. They are also very small compared to the scale of what was taken. The story we are telling tonight is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of survival and of the remarkable persistence of connection to country across conditions that were designed to sever that connection permanently. The harbour that Arthur Phillip sailed into in January 1788, the one he described as the finest harbour in the world, was not an empty or an ownerless harbour. It was a managed landscape, a productive and sophisticated human community, a place that had been known and loved and cared for by specific families for a span of time that makes the entire history of European civilization look like a brief and slightly frantic episode. Those families are still here. Their connection to this place has not been extinguished, even if it has been suppressed, disrupted, and denied. The land at the head of Sydney Cove, the site of the original British settlement, is now covered by the CBD, by the towers of glass and concrete that make Sydney's skyline one of the most recognizable in the world. Under that skyline, under the foundations of the banks and the office blocks and the luxury hotels, are the middens and the occupation sites and the engraving grounds of the Cadigal people. Some of these have been excavated and studied by archaeologists working in advance of development. Many more have been destroyed by development without any study at all. The rocks area, immediately to the west of the bridge, which is now preserved as a tourist precinct and historical district, sits on ground that was among the most intensively occupied parts of the original settlement and before it among the most significant parts of Cadigal country. The history presented in the rocks tends to emphasize the convict and colonial period, the Georgian architecture, the maritime history, the picturesque qualities of the 19th century streetscape. The deeper history, the Aboriginal history, is present but marginal in the way it is told and displayed. There is a specific place in the rocks that deserves particular attention. On the western side of the precinct, tucked between the bridge and the old colonial warehouses, there are traces of a site that was used continuously by Aboriginal people through the early contact period and into the colonial era. The people who gathered there, in the early years of the colony, were not simply passive observers of the colonial project. They were negotiating, trading, gathering information, maintaining as much as they could of the social and political relationships that had structured their world before the British arrived. The space between the settlement and the surrounding country was a zone of complex interaction, not simply of conflict, and the Aboriginal people who navigated that zone did so with considerable sophistication. Barangaroo herself, as a member of the Camaragal community of the Northern Shore, would have crossed the harbour regularly to engage with the settlement. The relationship she had with Governor Phillip was not simply a relationship between a colonial administrator and a subject. It was a relationship between two political actors operating within different frameworks of authority and obligation. Phillip recognized this, at least partially. He was not the worst of the early colonial governors, though the standards by which we judge early colonial governance are not high. He attempted, with limited success, to prevent the worst violence and to maintain some kind of workable relationship with the harbour clans. He failed, partly because the forces he was operating with had interests and imperatives that overrode his intentions, and partly because the fundamental premise of the colonial project, that the land was available for the taking without the consent of its owners, was not something he questioned seriously enough to act on. The question of whether different individual decisions, different individual choices by the early governors or by the Colonial Office in London or by the settlers themselves could have produced a fundamentally different outcome is a question that historians argue about. It is not an idle question. It matters for how we understand the nature of what happened. If the dispossession was inevitable, a structural outcome of the forces of colonialism that no individual choice could have altered, then the history is a tragedy in the Greek sense, determined by forces larger than any human actor. If it was contingent, if different choices could have produced different outcomes, then the culpability of specific individuals and specific institutions is more direct and more personal. The evidence suggests, as it usually does in these cases, that the truth is somewhere in the middle. There were structural forces at work, the enormous military and demographic advantages of the British Empire, the ideological frameworks of colonialism and racial hierarchy, the economic imperatives that made land acquisition central to the colonial project. These were powerful forces, and they shaped what was possible. But within those structural constraints, choices were made, and many of those choices were made badly, or cruelly, or negligently, by people who had the information and the authority to choose otherwise. The Appin massacre was ordered by a specific man, Lachlan Macquarie, who had specific information about the human cost of what he was authorizing and who chose to proceed anyway. The protection board that removed Aboriginal children from their families operated according to policies made by specific individuals who knew, at least at some level, what they were doing. The legal fiction of terra nullius was maintained across the Australian legal system for more than 2 centuries by people who had access to the evidence of Aboriginal social organisation and chose to interpret that evidence in ways that served the colonial interest. We are at a point in Australian history where the full story is becoming harder to ignore. The combination of Indigenous advocacy, academic historical research, legal process, and public conscience has produced a situation in which the official historical narrative can no longer maintain the comfortable silences and the strategic gaps that it once relied on. The Closing the Gap framework, the NAIDOC week observances, the acknowledgement of country at public events, the Indigenous protected areas, the language revitalization programs, the native title system, and the ongoing conversations about treaty and constitutional recognition, all of these are imperfect and contested expressions of a growing recognition that the full story of this country has to be told and engaged with honestly. But the telling of that story is still resisted in many quarters, and the resistance is not simply a matter of ignorance. It is, in many cases, a matter of the same interest-based reasoning that drove the original suppression. Full acknowledgement of the rights and the history of the Aboriginal families who owned Sydney before anyone else would have implications for property, for law, for the distribution of resources and authority. These are real implications, and they are resisted by people who benefit from the current arrangements. The story of Australia's deep history, the 65,000 years of sophisticated human occupation that preceded the colonial period, is the story that belongs at the foundation of any honest account of what Australia is. It is not a footnote. It is not a prologue. It is the main story. The 236 years since the first fleet arrived are a relatively brief chapter in a very long book. The families who wrote the earlier chapters are still here. Their names were not erased permanently. They are being recovered, with care and with effort, by people who understand that a country cannot truly know itself until it knows its full history. The harbour is still beautiful. The sandstone is still ancient under your feet. The water is still blue in that particular morning light. And somewhere in that blue, somewhere in the patterns of current and tide and seasonal change, is the knowledge that the Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and all the other families of this harbour deposited here over thousands of years of loving and careful attention. That knowledge is not entirely gone. Some of it is being recovered, some of it was never entirely lost. And all of it is a reminder that the place you are standing in, wherever you are in Sydney, is older and deeper and more richly inhabited than any tourist map or any history textbook or any property title has yet managed to convey. The rock engravings at Ku-ring-gai Chase sit on sandstone platforms that look out over the Hawkesbury River system and the bays and inlets of the northern reaches of the harbour. On a clear day, from some of these platforms, you can see the water stretching away toward the coast. The engravings themselves, the whales and the fish, and the human figures, and the geometric patterns cut into the pale stone, are now protected under state and national heritage legislation. Visitors can walk to them along maintained tracks. Interpretive signs explain something of their significance. Rangers are employed to prevent the kind of vandalism and inadvertent damage that once occurred before the sites were formally managed. But the protection is imperfect, and the management is underfunded. There are sites that have been damaged by bushfire, by erosion, by the physical pressure of too many visitors on fragile stone, and by deliberate vandalism that is motivated by contempt for the culture these engravings represent. There are sites that are not adequately protected, either because they have not been formally documented or because the resources to protect them properly are not available. There are sites on private land where the landowners are not aware of their significance or are not required to protect them. The legal protection for Aboriginal cultural heritage in New South Wales has been strengthened over the past few decades, but it remains in many respects inadequate and inconsistently enforced. The Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act 2021 represented a significant step forward in some respects, giving Aboriginal communities more direct control over the management of heritage in their country and streamlining the process through which that management occurs. But the implementation of new frameworks always takes time, and the legacy of decades of inadequate protection has left a significant backlog of damage and loss that cannot simply be legislated away. The shell middens of the harbour are another category of cultural heritage that has been significantly damaged over the colonial and post-colonial periods. Middens are not glamorous monuments. They are, at their most basic, accumulations of rubbish, the kitchen waste of communities that ate shellfish over long periods. But this rubbish contains information. The species composition of the midden tells us about the fish and shellfish species that were present in the harbour at different times. The radiocarbon dates of organic material from the midden tells us when the site was occupied. The presence of other materials, stone tools, bone fragments, ochre, charcoal from fires, adds to the picture. And the spatial distribution of middens around the harbour tells us something about the patterns of movement and occupation of the communities that created them. Many middens have been destroyed by development, by erosion, and by deliberate clearance. Some were excavated before destruction, providing at least some information about what was lost. But many were destroyed without any record being made, and the information they contained is permanently gone. Some surviving middens are incorporated into parks and reserves, and are therefore afforded some degree of protection. Others are on private land or in the path of ongoing development. The most famous midden in Sydney, if that is the right word for it, is at the base of the sandstone cliffs near the water's edge at Blues Point on the northern shore of the harbour, opposite the rocks. It is partially visible when the water level is low and has been the subject of various archaeological investigations. The midden at Blues Point represents an occupation of the site that stretches back across a significant span of time, although the precise dating is complicated by the disturbed nature of the deposit. It is a reminder that the waterfront we look at today, the developed and commercially valuable waterfront of one of the world's most expensive harbour cities, was once a living landscape in which people camped and cooked and fished and maintained the daily routines of life. The relationship between the Eora clans and the specific aquatic environment of the harbour is perhaps worth exploring in one more specific dimension before we move on to the broader story of the colonial period and its aftermath. The oysters of Port Jackson were, before colonial settlement and the subsequent period of intensive harvesting and water pollution, one of the great natural resources of the harbour. The Sydney rock oyster, which was native to the harbour and the surrounding inlets, was a major food source for the coastal communities, as evidenced by the enormous quantities of oyster shell in the middens around the harbour. The harvesting of oysters from the rocky intertidal zones was part of the regular economic activity of the coastal clans, and the knowledge of which reefs were productive and when was part of the practical knowledge base of the community. The colonial settlers also valued the oysters. They were harvested commercially from the early colonial period, and the native oyster beds were severely depleted within a few decades of European settlement. By the middle of the 19th century, the once abundant native oyster beds of Port Jackson were largely gone, the result of overharvesting and of the degradation of water quality that accompanied the growth of the settlement. This ecological loss is not usually understood as a component of the dispossession, but it was. The destruction of the oyster beds removed a food source that had been part of the economic foundation of the coastal communities for thousands of years. It was another dimension of the systematic removal of the conditions that made Aboriginal life possible in this landscape. The story of the harbour's ecological transformation is, in many ways, a metaphor for the broader history. A complex, productive, and carefully managed system was encountered by a colonial power that had neither the knowledge nor the willingness to understand what it was encountering. The system was exploited without restraint and without any attempt to maintain the conditions that made it productive. The result was a dramatic reduction in the productivity and the diversity of the system. And the people who had managed the system for thousands of years were simultaneously denied any role in its management and blamed for the poverty that resulted from their exclusion from their own resources. The restoration of the harbour's ecology is now a significant public policy concern. Water quality has improved significantly since the mid-20th century as a result of major investments in sewage treatment and stormwater management. Native fish populations have recovered in some areas. The native oyster is being actively reintroduced in various parts of the harbour. These restoration efforts are genuine and the improvements are real. But the knowledge of the pre-colonial condition of the harbour, the detailed ecological understanding that the Cadigal and the Wungal and the other harbour clans possessed, which would be invaluable in guiding and evaluating restoration efforts, is largely unavailable because the system that destroyed the harbour's ecology also destroyed the knowledge system that understood it. There is a particular sadness in this specific loss. The people who had the most detailed and the most practically useful knowledge of the ecology of Port Jackson are not available to be consulted, because those people are gone. What survives of their knowledge, in the oral traditions of their descendants, in the fragmentary records of early colonial observers, and in the ecological signals embedded in the midden records and the engraving sites, is being consulted where possible. But the depth of knowledge that existed is gone, and no amount of ecological monitoring or scientific research can fully replace it. Let us now turn to some of the specific individuals whose stories, recovered from the colonial record and from oral tradition, give us the most vivid picture of the world that existed at the harbour before and during the early colonial period. We have talked about Benelong and Barangaroo and Colby and Pemulwuy. Let us spend some time with others who are less well known but whose stories are equally important. Patyagarang was a young woman who comes to us through the records of William Dawes, one of the more remarkable figures in the early colonial period. Dawes was an officer of the Marines who served in the First Fleet and who remained in the colony until 1791. He was a scientist and a linguist with genuine curiosity and genuine respect for the Aboriginal people he encountered, qualities that were unusual in his time and context. He compiled a series of notebooks in which he recorded the Sydney language, not just word lists, but actual conversations, with phonetic transcriptions, grammatical observations, and occasional contextual notes. The conversations in Dawes's notebooks are extraordinary documents. They give us a window into the actual speech of specific individuals in the early contact period, something that almost no other source provides. And they give us, in particular, a remarkable portrait of Patiegarang, who was one of Dawes's primary language informants and who appears to have had a relationship with him that was more complex and more equal than most cross-cultural interactions of the period. Patiegarang was probably in her early teens when she worked with Dawes, which makes the sophistication of her engagement with him all the more remarkable. She corrected his pronunciation. She explained nuances of meaning that he had missed. She told him when he had recorded a word incorrectly. She discussed with him, through his limited Aboriginal language and her limited English, things that were happening in the wider world of the harbour clans, the political tensions, the social dynamics, the practical concerns of daily life. The notebooks give us a sense of a young woman with a sharp mind and a strong sense of her own cultural authority, engaged in a genuine intellectual exchange across the boundary of language and culture. What happened to Patiegarang after Dawes left the colony is not known. The record stops when he departs. This is one of the recurrent frustrations of trying to reconstruct the histories of individual Aboriginal people from the early colonial period. They appear in the colonial record when they are useful to colonial purposes, and they disappear when those purposes are served. The continuity of their lives and their contributions to the history of the place is not recorded in any systematic way. Dawes's notebooks were eventually rediscovered in the 20th century in the archives of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where they had been deposited after Dawes's death. They are now a central resource in the ongoing work of Sydney language revitalization, providing a level of phonetic and grammatical detail that no other source can offer. The people working on that revitalization often describe their relationship to the notebooks with a mixture of gratitude for the extraordinary gift of Dawes's careful recording, and grief for the circumstances in which that recording became necessary, the imminent loss of a living language spoken by people who were dying. Nanbury was another figure whose story illuminates the complexity of the early contact period. He was a young boy of the Cadigal clan who was orphaned by the smallpox epidemic of 1789 and who was subsequently adopted by John White, the Surgeon General of the colony. Nanbury's adoption by White was not a simple act of charity, and it was not without complications, but it gave him access to the colonial world in ways that most Aboriginal people of the period did not have, and it allowed him to develop a bicultural identity, partly rooted in his Cadigal heritage and partly shaped by his experience of colonial life. He grew up to serve in the Royal Navy and to travel outside Australia. He maintained his connections with the Aboriginal community throughout his life and is documented in the colonial records as a man who moved between the two worlds of the harbour with considerable ease and some strategic sophistication. He died in 1821 at about 36 years of age. His grave is believed to be in the churchyard at St. 24, John's Anglican Church in Parramatta, though the exact location within the churchyard is not known. Nanbury's story, like Bennelong's and Colby's, is a story of a person navigating an impossible situation with as much intelligence and agency as the circumstances allowed. These were not people who simply accepted what was happening to their world. They were people who were actively trying to manage it, to protect their communities and their own interests and identities within conditions that were designed to prevent them from doing so. The women of the harbour clans are less visible in the colonial record than the men, partly because the colonial observers tended to focus their attention on men, and partly because the social roles of women in the harbour communities while absolutely central to the economic and social life of those communities, were roles that the colonial observers understood poorly and valued little. Barangaroo is the most prominent exception, and she is prominent precisely because her refusal to accept the terms the colonial observers wanted to impose on her was so forceful that it could not be ignored. But there were many others. The women who fished the harbour in their bark canoes were the primary suppliers of protein for their communities. The women who processed skins and made tools and gathered plant foods and managed the daily logistics of camp life were doing work that was as essential as anything the men did, and in some cases more so, because the work of gathering and preparation was constant and reliable, where the work of hunting and fishing was intermittent and uncertain. The women who held the knowledge of plant medicines, the women who managed the births and deaths and illnesses of their communities, the women who transmitted through song and story and practical demonstration the knowledge that maintained the culture across generations, these were people of extraordinary capability and importance, whose individual names are almost entirely lost to us. The women who were the mothers and grandmothers and aunts of the people who are documented in the colonial record are the people through whom the genetic and cultural continuity of the harbour clans was maintained. Their descendants include the people who are today working to recover and revitalise the languages and cultures of those clans. They are the foundation on which everything else rests, and they deserve to be acknowledged as such, even in the absence of names. There is a beach in Sydney, one of the northern beaches, that sits at the mouth of a creek where archaeological evidence suggests human occupation going back many thousands of years. The creek flows from a long, shallow valley that was, in the pre-colonial period, a productive fishing and camping ground for the people of the northern harbours. The beach itself is now a popular surfing and swimming beach. There is a car park, a toilet block, some food outlets during the summer season. On busy summer days, the beach is crowded with people who have no idea that the ground under the car park and the surrounding headlands was the heart of an Aboriginal community that maintained a continuous presence in this specific place across a period that dwarfs anything in the history of Western civilization. This is not an unusual situation for Sydney. It is, in fact, typical. Almost every significant point of public use in Greater Sydney, every beach and headland and park and reserve and waterway that people visit for recreation or relaxation or simply for the pleasure of being in a beautiful place, sits on land that was the specific country of specific Aboriginal families whose relationship to that land was intimate, long-standing, and enormously complex. The pleasure that people take in these places today is not wrong. It is not a pleasure that needs to be guilty or ashamed, but it is a pleasure that becomes richer and more real when it is taken with awareness of the full history of the place, including the history that preceded the colonial period and the history of how the transition from one regime to another was accomplished. The argument that acknowledging Aboriginal history makes non-Aboriginal Australians feel bad, or that it is somehow divisive or backward-looking, is an argument that should be listened to carefully and then firmly set aside. The truth is not divisive. The history is not the exclusive property of Aboriginal Australians. It is the history of the place, and it belongs to everyone who lives in that place, because you cannot genuinely belong somewhere whose full story you refuse to know. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else gave this place its character. The harbour that Arthur Phillip described as the finest harbour in the world was not simply a geographic accident. It was a managed landscape that had been shaped by thousands of years of human attention, of burning and fishing and camping and ceremony, and the intimate knowledge of every tree and rock and current. The beauty of Sydney is, in part, a consequence of that management. The country was cared for, and the caring made it magnificent. To live here, and to love this place, without acknowledging who cared for it first, is to love a fiction. The names that were erased are coming back, slowly, imperfectly, against resistance that is sometimes institutional and sometimes personal, and sometimes simply the dead weight of habit and indifference. They are coming back because the people who carry them refuse to be erased completely. Because across every generation of the colonial period, even the worst of it, there were Aboriginal people who held onto the threads of knowledge and identity, and connection to country that the system was designed to cut. And there are people today, in greater numbers than at any point in the past 2 centuries, who are picking up those threads and weaving them back into the fabric of what Australia understands itself to be. The harbour is still there, the sandstone is still under your feet, the water is still blue, and the families who first knew this place are still here, still here, still here. Their names are Cadigal and Wangal and Camaragal and Gwagal and Darawal and Bidjigal and Guringai and all the others, and they were here first. The Parramatta River carries no monument to the Wangal people who fished its banks and managed its floodplains for thousands of years before a single European boat traced its current toward the place where Parramatta now stands. The river itself is named for an Aboriginal word, a word from the language of the local people that referred to the place where the eels gather, or something near that meaning, the precise translation being one of those details that became uncertain in the process of its recording by people who did not speak the language and were not particularly invested in getting the nuance right. But the word survived, the river carries it, and in the carrying, even if imperfectly, even if without full acknowledgement of what the word represents and where it came from, there is a thread of continuity that connects the present to the deep past. The western suburbs of Sydney, the areas that spread inland along the Parramatta River and its tributaries, were among the first areas outside the immediate harbour settlement to be opened to colonial agricultural settlement. The Wangal and their neighbours bore the initial weight of this expansion as their river flats and creek valleys were taken for farms and their hunting and fishing grounds were cleared and fenced. The resistance was real, and it was sustained across years, but the outcome was inevitable given the imbalance of forces. The Parramatta area was particularly significant ceremonially as well as economically for the Western Harbour groups. The confluence of freshwater streams and the tidal limits of the river created an ecological richness that made it a gathering place. The eel runs that gave the river its name were a major seasonal food event that brought people together from across the basin. The specific knowledge of how to take eels, of the seasonal timing of the runs, of the construction and placement of the fish traps that concentrated them for harvest, was the kind of specialist knowledge that conferred status and generated obligation in the social structure of the clans. The man or the family who held that knowledge and who managed the eel fishery was holding a significant social resource as well as an economic one. The eel traps themselves were sophisticated structures. They were not simple baskets or nets. They were engineered features of the river, constructed from stone and wood in ways that directed the movement of eels into configurations where they could be efficiently harvested. Some of these structures required significant labor to construct and regular maintenance to keep functional. They were not casual devices. They were investments in infrastructure that reflect the kind of long-term thinking and long-term occupation that is incompatible with the image of nomadic wanderers that the colonial narrative often deployed. You do not build permanent fish traps in a river if you are not planning to be there to use them in future seasons. The stone fish traps of the Darling River in the inland are perhaps the most dramatic examples of this kind of water engineering by Aboriginal Australians, but there were structures in the waterways of the Sydney Basin as well. These were among the things that were destroyed earliest and most thoroughly by colonial settlement, because they were in the rivers and the creeks that the settlers needed for their own purposes, and because their significance was not understood or acknowledged. The oyster middens of Ku-ring-gai were formed over a period of thousands of years by the repeated occupations of groups coming to the waterways of the northern harbours to harvest shellfish, to rest, to conduct ceremonies, to maintain the social connections that structured their world. Walking through the park today, on the maintained tracks between the documented engraving sites, you are walking on ground that carries layers of human occupation that are, in their own way, as deep and as rich as any archaeological site in the world. The difficulty is that they do not look like what we expect deep history to look like. They do not have pyramids or stone monuments or written inscriptions. They have middens and engravings and the traces of hearths and the marks of human presence that require knowledge and care to read. This difficulty of reading is itself a product of the colonial encounter. The European tradition of heritage and antiquity had very specific ideas about what impressive deep history looked like. It looked like Rome. It looked like Egypt. It looked like Greece. It looked like stone columns and written language and monumental public buildings. The Australian Indigenous tradition of heritage looked like something completely different, and the failure to recognize it as heritage at all was not simply a failure of observation. It was a failure of imagination, compounded by the ideological convenience of refusing to recognize what you had taken. The concept of country, with a capital C, as used by Aboriginal Australians, is the most important concept for understanding what was lost and what is being recovered in the story of Sydney's deep history. Country is not land in the Western legal sense. Country is a living relationship. It includes everything that Western ecological science understands as ecosystem, but it also includes the spiritual and the ceremonial and the narrative dimensions that Western analytical frameworks tend to separate from the physical. To be of country is to be responsible for it, to know it, to be known by it, to participate in its ongoing creation and maintenance through ceremony and story, and the practical work of living carefully within it. The loss of country for the harbour clans was not simply the loss of land. It was the loss of the matrix of relationships within which their lives had meaning. When the land was taken, when the fishing grounds were fouled, when the ceremony was prohibited, when the children were removed, what was being dismantled was not just an economic system or a political system. It was the entire framework within which human life made sense. This is why the impacts of dispossession cannot be measured simply in terms of material poverty, devastating as that poverty is. The impacts also manifest as the particular forms of distress that come from the loss of meaning, from the rupture of identity, from the disconnection from country that is the deepest wound of the colonial experience. The healing of that wound, where it is possible at all, comes through reconnection. It comes through the recovery of language and story and ceremony. It comes through the formal and informal acknowledgement of rights and connection. It comes through the practical work of being on country, of caring for it, of learning from it and contributing to it. The people who are doing this work, the Aboriginal communities of Greater Sydney who are active in language revitalisation and cultural education and land management and legal advocacy, are doing healing work, and they are doing it in conditions that are still far from adequate. The support that this work receives from the broader Australian community is variable and inconsistent. There are people who are deeply and genuinely committed to it, who put their own time and resources and professional skills into supporting Indigenous-led initiatives. There are institutions that have moved significantly toward genuine partnership and genuine respect in their engagement with Aboriginal communities. And there are parts of the broader community that remain indifferent or actively hostile, who see the acknowledgement of Aboriginal rights and history as a threat to their own identity or their own interests. The geography of Sydney itself is a map of this ambivalence. The affluent suburbs of the Eastern Harbour and the North Shore, where property values are among the highest in the country, sit on some of the most significant Aboriginal cultural landscapes in the region. The relationship between property value and the erasure of Aboriginal history is not coincidental. The desirability of the harbour and the coastal areas of Sydney was built in part on the removal of the people who first knew and valued those areas. The expensive view from the living room window on the lower North Shore, the privileged access to the harbour that the most sought-after addresses in the city offer, these are the products of a dispossession that the real estate market has never had to account for. This is not a comfortable observation for people who own or aspire to own property in those areas, but it is an honest one. The history of how Sydney came to be distributed as it is, who lives where, who has access to the most beautiful and most valuable parts of the harbour city, is a history that is inseparable from the dispossession of the families who owned those places first. We are now deep in the night, and we have covered a great deal of ground. We have moved from the deep time of the harbour, 65,000 years and more of human presence, to the specific families who occupied specific territories within the Greater Sydney Basin, to the contact period and the individual stories of Bennelong and Barangaroo and Colby and Pemulwuy and Patiegarang and Nanbury, to the mechanisms of dispossession and the forms of resistance, to the current state of language and cultural recovery, and the ongoing struggles for recognition and rights. We have tried to tell the story honestly, without the omissions and the strategic silences that have distorted the official historical narrative. What remains to be said is something about the future, because the history we have been exploring is not finished. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are not a historical phenomenon. They are present, active, and engaged. And the questions their presence raises are live, political, and legal questions that Australian society is still working through. The question of treaty, of a formal agreement between the Australian state and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that acknowledges the original sovereignty of those peoples and establishes a framework for the ongoing relationship between them and the state, is a question that is being discussed in Australia today with more seriousness than at any previous point. Victoria has a formal treaty process underway. The Northern Territory has been engaged in similar conversations. Other states and territories are at various stages of similar discussions. The national government has committed in principle to a treaty process, though the specifics remain to be developed. What a genuine treaty would mean for Sydney, for the harbour clans and their descendants and their relationship to the city that was built on their country, is something that can only be worked out through sustained and respectful negotiation between the parties involved. It cannot be designed from outside, it cannot be imposed from above, but it can be facilitated, and it can be supported by a broader community that understands the history and recognizes the justice of the claim. The harbour is there, the morning light is on the water, the sandstone is under your feet. The families who owned this place before anyone else are still here, still caring for their country as best they can within the constraints of a system that has not yet fully made room for them. Their names are coming back. The names that were erased are being recovered and inscribed again in the consciousness of this city, of this country. Cadigal, Wangal, Camaraigal, Gwegal, Darawal, Bidjigal, Guringai. These are the names, these are the families. These are the people who owned Sydney before anyone else, and whose ownership was never genuinely extinguished, no matter how hard the colonial system tried to make it so. The story is long, and it is not over. But the families who own it are still here, and that, in the end, is the most important thing. As you lie here in the dark, listening to this, wherever you are in the world, there is something worth carrying with you from this long journey through the history of Sydney's deep past. The story of the harbour clans, of the Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaraigal and the Gwegal and the Darawal and the Bidjigal and the Guringai and all the others, is not just a local story. It is not just an Australian story. It is a human story about what happens when the depth and the legitimacy of one civilization's relationship to a place is refused recognition by another civilization that arrives with the military power to back up its refusal. This story has played out in different specific forms across the globe, wherever the expansion of European colonialism encountered peoples who had been in their places long enough to know them deeply and care for them sustainably. The patterns are different in each case. The specific histories are different. The current situations are different. But the core dynamic, the refusal of recognition, the dispossession, the suppression, and then the slow and difficult recovery, is a pattern that appears wherever you look honestly at the history of the past 5 centuries. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else were managing one of the most beautiful harbours on earth for 65,000 years. The depth of their knowledge of that harbour, the sophistication of their management of it, the richness of the social and ceremonial life that they built around it, all of this is extraordinary. All of it was dismissed, denied, suppressed, and in many cases actively destroyed by a colonial system that had neither the knowledge nor the humility to recognize what it was encountering. But the families are still here. Their names are being recovered. Their languages are being revived. Their rights are being advocated for with increasing sophistication and increasing public support. The harbour is still beautiful. And the story, the real story, the full story, is still being told. It is being told by the descendants of the families themselves, and it is being told by people like the makers of this video and the listeners who stay with it through the small hours, carrying the weight of what was done here and the hope of what might yet be made right. The light will come up over the harbour in the morning, and it will be beautiful, as it always is. And if you know the full history of the place where that beauty lives, if you carry the names of the families who owned it first and who loved it longest, then the beauty is richer and more real, and the obligation that it carries is clearer. We are all, in one way or another, part of this story now. The families who were here first made this place what it is. What we do with it, and with the knowledge of what happened to them, is something we will have to answer for. Sleep well. The harbour is still there. The sandstone is still ancient. The names are coming back. There is a particular quality of darkness in the Sydney bush, at night, that people who have only known the city do not fully understand. It is not the absolute blackness of an overcast rural night, nor the uniform greyness of an overcast suburban night. It is a darkness that is full of gradations, full of the shapes of things barely visible, full of the sounds of a landscape that never stops being alive. On clear nights, the sky above the ridgelines of the national parks around Sydney is crowded with stars in a way that is genuinely startling. If you have only ever seen the Sydney sky from inside the light pollution of the metropolitan area, the Milky Way arches across, not as a faint smear, but as a dense and complex river of light. And in that river of light, if you know how to look, there are shapes. Not the dot-to-dot shapes of the Western star sign tradition. Something stranger and more interesting. The constellation tradition of the harbour clans and of Aboriginal Australians more broadly is one of the most sophisticated and most undervalued astronomical traditions in human history. It is also, like so much else in this story, one of the most threatened, because it is embedded in languages and in oral traditions and in ceremonial contexts that have been severely disrupted by the colonial process. But it is not gone. And in recent years, as the scientific community has begun to take seriously the depth and the sophistication of Indigenous astronomical knowledge, the work of recovering and documenting and understanding this tradition has accelerated in ways that are producing genuinely remarkable results. The distinctive feature of Aboriginal Australian sky knowledge, the feature that most starkly differentiates it from the Western astronomical tradition, is the attention paid to darkness rather than to light. Western astronomy, from the Babylonians through the Greeks to the present, has primarily been a science of the stars, of the luminous points of light that pattern the night sky. The constellations of the Western tradition are outlines drawn between stars, imaginary lines connecting light points into shapes that carry cultural meaning. The Aboriginal tradition of the southeast of the continent does this too, to some extent. The Pleiades, the small star cluster that sits in the constellation of Taurus in the Western tradition, has an equivalent in the traditions of virtually every Aboriginal group across the continent, appearing in stories that encode ecological information about the seasons and the movements of food sources. But the more distinctive feature of the Aboriginal astronomical tradition, the feature that strikes modern astronomers as genuinely unusual and genuinely sophisticated, is the use of the dark patches in the Milky Way as the primary canvas for sky mapping. The dark patches are not absences. They are regions of interstellar dust that absorb the light of the stars behind them, creating shapes of darkness against the bright background of the galactic plane. These shapes are large. They are stable, moving with the rest of the sky through their seasonal cycle but maintaining their shapes indefinitely. And for people who are paying careful attention to the night sky, over long periods of time and with the specific motivation of connecting sky patterns to ecological events, these dark shapes provide a rich and distinctive set of navigational and calendrical markers. The emu in the sky is the best known and most widely documented of the dark constellation figures. Its head is formed by the dark nebula called the Coalsack, which sits adjacent to the bright star Acrux at the foot of the Southern Cross. The long neck and body of the emu are formed by a chain of dark patches that run for a considerable angular distance along the Milky Way towards Scorpius. The whole figure is enormous by the standards of Western constellations, spanning a large portion of the southern sky. The emu's orientation in the sky changes across the year as the Earth orbits the Sun, just as any other celestial feature changes its appearance and position relative to the horizon over the course of the year. In late autumn, when the emu in the sky is in its running position, parallel to the horizon in the late evening, the female emus on the ground are sitting on their eggs. In late spring, when the sky emu is in a different orientation, the chicks have hatched and grown, and the emus are beginning to disperse from their nesting areas. This encoding of ecological information in the orientation and position of an astronomical feature is not accidental. It is a deliberate technology, a way of using the fixed patterns of the sky as a calendar that is always available, always reliable, and always calibrated to the specific ecological rhythms of the Australian landscape. For the harbour clans, the sky knowledge would have been calibrated to the specific ecology of the harbour and the coastal country. The seasonal arrival of different fish species, the runs of mullet through the harbour entrance, the appearance of yellowfin tuna in the coastal waters, the breeding season of the rock lobsters, the timing of the whale migration, all of these ecological events could in principle be encoded in sky patterns, though the specific details of how the harbour clans read the sky for coastal ecological information are not as well documented as some aspects of inland sky knowledge. What is documented in the fragmentary records of the early colonial period and in the oral traditions that survive is that the sky was not simply a backdrop or a navigation aid for the harbour clans. It was a living text, full of stories and encoded information that was read continuously by people who spent their nights outside under the actual sky rather than under ceilings and roofs. The knowledge was practical. The sky told you when to expect certain foods, when to conduct certain ceremonies, when to move from one part of the country to another. But it was also cosmological. The sky was where the stories lived, where the ancestors went when they died, where the forces that shaped the world had their primary habitation. The relationship between sky knowledge and ceremony is one of the most important and most elusive dimensions of the intellectual tradition of the harbour clans. Ceremonies were timed to celestial events. The gathering of people for ceremony was, in some cases, triggered by the appearance of certain stars or certain astronomical configurations. The direction in which ceremonial activity was oriented, the geographic alignment of sacred sites and ceremonial grounds, may in some cases have been connected to astronomical events, though the evidence for this in the Sydney region specifically is preliminary. The rock engravings of the Ku-ring-gai region include some figures and configurations that researchers have proposed as potentially astronomical in their reference. Circular motifs that might represent the sun or the moon, configurations of dots that might represent star clusters, sites oriented in ways that create alignments with celestial events at specific times of year. These interpretations are contested, and they need to be approached with care because the temptation to find astronomical significance in every unusual configuration is a temptation that has led researchers into error in other contexts. But the general principle that Aboriginal rock art sites were chosen with attention to their relationships with celestial phenomena has been documented in enough cases elsewhere in Australia that it would be surprising if it were entirely absent from the Sydney region. The documenting of these potential astronomical connections is work that is proceeding in collaboration with Aboriginal community members and with academic researchers in both astronomy and archaeology. The methodology required is demanding. You need people with deep knowledge of both the celestial mechanics involved and the cultural context in which the art was created. You need careful, rigorous documentation of site orientations and the celestial events that might be connected to them. And you need the kind of long-term sustained engagement with specific sites that produces genuine understanding rather than the superficial pattern matching that can lead to false conclusions. One of the most striking recent developments in the study of Aboriginal astronomy is the recognition that the knowledge systems involved are not just culturally interesting but scientifically significant. Certain observations embedded in Aboriginal oral traditions about the behavior of specific stars appear to encode information about actual astronomical events that occurred thousands of years ago, information that could not have been derived from the observable behavior of the stars as they are now. This suggests either that the observations were made at a time when those events were current, which in some cases implies a tradition of several thousand years of continuous astronomical observation, or that the observations are the result of systematic monitoring of changes in stellar behavior over very long periods, which implies a degree of continuity and sophistication in the observational tradition that Western science has been slow to credit. The Pleiades account is perhaps the most striking example. In many Aboriginal traditions across Australia, including traditions that appear to be connected to the communities of southeastern Australia, the Pleiades are described as a group of girls or young women who are being pursued by the stars of Orion's belt, which are described as male figures. This is a story about the relationship between specific celestial bodies that appears to encode genuine astronomical information about the proper motion of those stars relative to each other, a very slow change in their apparent positions that would only become perceptible over thousands of years of careful observation. The implication is that the story carries information deposited during a period many thousands of years in the past. This kind of deep-time encoding of astronomical information is, if true, genuinely extraordinary. It would mean that the oral tradition of Aboriginal Australian communities had maintained accurate observational data across a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of Western astronomy look brief. And it would mean that the dismissal of Aboriginal intellectual traditions as primitive or as mere mythology was not just ethically wrong, but scientifically wrong as well. A failure to recognize genuine knowledge because it was expressed in unfamiliar forms. The harbour clans of Sydney were part of this broader tradition of sky knowledge and sky story. The specific details of how they read the sky, which stars and configurations they attended to, and what ecological and ceremonial information those features encoded are not fully recoverable. Too much was lost in the disruptions of the colonial period, but enough survives in the oral traditions of the communities and in the fragmentary records of sympathetic colonial observers, to make clear that the people who managed the harbour of Sydney were also managing a sophisticated relationship with the sky above it, using the heavens as a source of information and a framework for meaning in ways that are still being understood. The language in which this sky knowledge was encoded, the Sydney language of the coastal Eora clans, is another dimension of the loss that is only gradually being appreciated. Language is not merely a communication tool. It is a thinking tool. The specific structures and vocabulary of a language shape the way its speakers understand and engage with the world. The Sydney language, like other Aboriginal languages, contained categories and distinctions and ways of relating concepts to each other that do not have direct equivalents in English. The specific ways in which it encoded relationships between people and country, the specific vocabulary it had for the features and behaviors of the harbour and the coastal landscape, the specific ceremonial and narrative terminology that carried the knowledge traditions of the community, all of this was a cognitive resource of enormous sophistication that was reduced to silence within a few generations of colonial contact. The recovery of the Sydney language is a project that is driven primarily by the Aboriginal community of the Sydney region, with the support of linguists and language recovery specialists and institutions like the ERASED, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which holds significant collections of historical, linguistic, and cultural documentation. The work of recovery is painstaking and difficult. The available documentation is fragmentary, inconsistent, and filtered through the limitations of the people who created it. Colonial observers who were not linguists and who were recording a language they had little understanding of in a phonetic system that was not designed for the sounds of that language. But the work is producing results. Words and grammatical structures that were recorded in the early colonial period are being combined with the oral memory of community members. with the comparative analysis of related languages that have been better documented, and with the systematic reconstruction of probable forms using the techniques of historical linguistics. The resulting language is not identical to the language spoken before 1788. It could not be. Too much is missing, and too much of what survives is uncertain. But it is a genuine language, shaped by the original, as faithfully as the available evidence allows, and it is being spoken and sung and taught to children. It is alive. The living of a recovered language is not just a cultural or political statement, though it is both of those things. It is also a cognitive act, a way of regaining access to the specific ways of understanding the world that the language encodes. When children learn to say the names for the birds and the fish and the trees of the harbour country in the language that was developed over thousands of years of intimate engagement with that country, they are not just learning a vocabulary. They are inheriting a framework for understanding their relationship to that country that is different from what English offers, and that may, in some respects, be more accurate and more useful as a guide for living in this specific place. The effort to revive and maintain Aboriginal languages in Australia is supported by legislation and by government funding programs. Though the level of funding is widely considered inadequate given the scale of the task and the urgency of the situation, many Aboriginal languages are at the very edge of extinction, held by a single remaining fluent speaker or by a handful of people with partial fluency. The Sydney language is in a less precarious position than some, partly because the early documentation, though fragmentary, is more extensive than for many other languages, and partly because the Sydney community has maintained a degree of continuous engagement with language recovery over a longer period. But it is still a fragile recovery, and it requires sustained investment and sustained community engagement to maintain its momentum. The schools of Western and Southwestern Sydney, where significant Aboriginal communities are concentrated, are among the front lines of this language revival. Programs that teach Aboriginal language, that incorporate Aboriginal cultural knowledge into the curriculum, and that create space for Aboriginal children to engage with their heritage in an educational setting, are producing a generation of young people who have a relationship with their cultural identity that is more confident and more grounded than any previous generation since the colonial disruption began. This is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the most important thing, because the future of the culture and the future of the connection to country that the culture encodes depends on whether it can be transmitted successfully to the next generation. The young people of the Sydney Aboriginal communities are navigating a complicated world. They are Australians in the full contemporary sense, connected to global culture, educated in the Australian school system, engaged with the same media and technologies and social currents as other young Australians. They are also the descendants of the Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and the Gweagal, the custodians of a cultural tradition that is older than any other on the continent, and that carries within it a relationship to this specific place that is unique and irreplaceable. Holding both of those identities simultaneously, in a society that does not always make room for the second, is work. It requires effort and resilience, and the support of community and of family structures that themselves require support to maintain. The intergenerational trauma of the colonial period is real, and it is present in the communities of Sydney's Aboriginal people today. The disruption of family structures through the removal policies, the economic marginalisation that followed from dispossession, the suppression of language and culture, the denial of identity, the specific forms of violence that were visited on Aboriginal communities and individuals across the colonial period, all of these have left marks that do not simply disappear when the formal policies change. They are carried in the bodies and the psychologies of the descendants of those who experience them, and they require specific and sustained support to heal. The healing is happening. It is happening in community-controlled health services that work with Aboriginal communities on their own terms. It is happening in cultural programs that create spaces for ceremony and story and the transmission of knowledge between generations. It is happening in language revival programs and in land management partnerships and in the legal advocacy of the land councils and the native title representative bodies. It is happening in the art galleries of Sydney, where Aboriginal artists from the harbour community are creating work that engages directly with the history of their country and with the ongoing reality of their connection to it. The art coming out of the Sydney Aboriginal community is extraordinary, and it deserves more attention than it generally receives in the broader cultural conversation about Australian art. The artists who are working with the history of the harbour, with the stories of the families who owned this place first, with the complex and painful and still unresolved dynamics of colonial encounter, are producing work that is both aesthetically powerful and intellectually serious. They are telling truths that the culture at large is still struggling to accommodate, and they are doing it with skill and precision and a depth of cultural understanding that makes their work among the most significant being produced in Australia today. The living reality of Aboriginal culture in Sydney is sometimes surprising to people who carry the assumption that Aboriginal culture is something from the past, something that survived in remote parts of Australia but was extinguished in the urban southeast. This assumption is wrong, and it is worth being direct about how wrong it is. Aboriginal people in Sydney today, in 2024, are maintaining and reviving and creating and arguing about and living their culture in ways that are as dynamic and as contested and as alive as any cultural tradition anywhere in the world. They are not relics. They are not the last survivors of something that ended 2 centuries ago. They are people living in the present, connected to a past that is deeper than most of the people around them can imagine, and working to ensure that the connection to that past and to the country that gave rise to it is maintained into the future. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are still here. Their names are Cadigal and Wangal and Camaragal and Guegal and Darawal and Bidjigal and Guringai. These names belong to people who are alive now, who have children and grandchildren, who go to work in the morning and return home in the evening, who love this city and its harbour with the specific love that comes from knowing you belong to it in a way that no one else quite does. They were the first Sydney-siders. They are still Sydney-siders. And the city belongs to them in a sense that all the property titles and all the colonial legislation and all the years of willful historical amnesia have not been able to extinguish. The courts of colonial New South Wales were an instrument of dispossession as direct as any military campaign. The legal system that arrived with the First Fleet was not simply a neutral framework of rules and procedures. It was a system designed for and by a specific society, operating on specific assumptions about property, sovereignty, and the nature of legal personhood that excluded Aboriginal Australians not by accident but by design. Understanding how the law was used against the harbour clans, and how it is now slowly being used to restore some measure of what was taken, is essential to understanding the full story of what happened here. The foundational legal claim, as we have established, was terra nullius, the fiction that the land was unoccupied and therefore available for British sovereignty without any obligation of treaty or purchase or negotiation. This fiction was applied from the very beginning. From the moment Philip raised the flag and read the proclamation at Sydney Cove in January 1788. It was a legal declaration with immediate practical consequences. From the moment it was made, Aboriginal people who resisted colonial expansion were not being treated as enemies in a military sense, as people with whom you might negotiate terms of surrender or peace. They were being treated as criminals, as people who were committing offences within the territory of the British Crown. The difference is significant. Enemy combatants have, in principle, certain rights under the laws of war. Criminals do not. This legal framing meant that the violence used against Aboriginal people who resisted colonial expansion from the earliest years through to the 20th century was consistently characterized as law enforcement rather than as warfare. The Appin massacre was not a battle. It was a punitive expedition against criminals who had been committing offences against the property of British subjects. The fact that those British subjects were themselves occupying land that they had no legitimate title to was not a consideration that the colonial legal system was designed to entertain. The Aboriginal people of the Sydney region had no standing in the colonial courts. They could not own property under colonial law. They could not enter into legal contracts. They could not testify in court. Their customary law, their system of rights and obligations and dispute resolution that had governed life in the Sydney Basin for thousands of years, had no recognition and no standing in the colonial legal framework. The legal system was, in the most literal possible sense, designed to render them invisible as rights-bearing subjects. This invisibility had concrete and devastating consequences. When Aboriginal people were killed by settlers, the killers could not generally be prosecuted because Aboriginal witnesses were not permitted to testify, and because the courts consistently found ways to avoid holding settlers accountable for violence against people who did not legally exist as persons. When Aboriginal people were dispossessed of their fishing grounds or their camping sites or their ceremonial places, they had no legal mechanism for challenging the dispossession. When Aboriginal children were taken from their families under the authority of the Protection Board, the families had no legal standing to challenge the removal. The legal system was not simply a passive framework that failed to protect Aboriginal people. It was an active instrument of their dispossession. The laws that governed the movement of Aboriginal people, the laws that confined them to reserves, the laws that regulated their employment and their wages and their ability to own property, the laws that gave the Protection Board the power to intervene in every aspect of their lives. These were not neutral administrative measures. They were a system of racial control, designed to manage a population that the colonial and post-colonial state had decided should not be permitted to exist on its own terms. The dismantling of this system has been slow and incomplete. The protection laws were progressively repealed from the 1960s onward. Aboriginal Australians were included in the national census for the first time after the 1967 referendum, which also transferred certain constitutional powers over Aboriginal affairs from the states to the Commonwealth. The Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 made racial discrimination in certain areas illegal for the first time. The Native Title Act of 1993, which followed the Mabo decision, created a legal framework for the recognition of Aboriginal rights to land. The apology in 2008 formally acknowledged the harm done by the removal policies. Each of these steps was hard-won, was resisted by powerful interests, and came after sustained advocacy by Aboriginal people and their supporters. Each of them represented a genuine step toward legal recognition of what had always been true, that Aboriginal Australians are the original owners of this land and that their rights to it were never legitimately extinguished. But each step also revealed how much more remained to be done, how deeply the structures of exclusion and discrimination were embedded in the legal and social and economic systems of Australian society. The native title system is perhaps the most instructive example. Native title is a genuine legal recognition, for the first time in Australian legal history, that Aboriginal people have rights to land that predate and are independent of any grant from the colonial or post-colonial state. This is not a small thing. It is a significant reversal of the terra nullius fiction that had governed Australian law for 2 centuries. But the native title system is also deeply limited in its practical effect, for reasons that go to the heart of how the colonial system operated. To claim native title, a claimant group must prove continuous connection to their claimed territory through their traditional laws and customs, from the time of effective sovereignty, which is generally taken to mean the time of first colonial contact or settlement, to the present day. This requirement of continuous connection is the point at which the system becomes deeply problematic, because the colonial process, as we have seen, was explicitly and systematically designed to disrupt and destroy precisely this continuity. The people who were removed from their land, who were prevented from practicing their ceremonies, who had their children taken and their languages suppressed, are now required to demonstrate the continuity of the connection that the system worked to destroy. In the Sydney metropolitan area specifically, native title has been extinguished over most of the land. This extinguishment has occurred partly through grants of freehold title to land over the past 2 centuries, which under Australian law extinguish native title. The practical effect is that in the areas where the harbour clans lived and managed and maintained their country for thousands of years, the areas that are now the most densely developed, and the most commercially valuable parts of one of the world's major cities, native title cannot in most cases be claimed because the title to the land has been granted away by a state that never had legitimate authority to grant it in the first place. The city of Sydney was built on stolen land. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a legal and historical fact. The land on which every building in the Sydney CBD stands, the land on which the Opera House sits and the bridge stands and the Barangaroo development rises, was taken without consent, without compensation, and without any legitimate legal authority from families who had managed and cared for it for thousands of years. That fact is not altered by the subsequent development that occurred on the land. It is not altered by the economic value that development has created. It is not altered by the passage of time or by the number of subsequent transactions through which the land has changed hands. The original taking was wrong, and the passage of time and the accumulation of development value does not make it right. What can be done in the light of this fact is a question that does not have a simple answer. Full restitution of the land, the return of every square meter of Sydney to the families from which it was taken, is not a practical possibility, and probably would not be desired even by those families who are also Sydney-siders, with children in Sydney schools and jobs in Sydney workplaces. But formal recognition of the wrong, material acknowledgement in the form of direct benefit from the development of the land that was taken, and genuine governance rights over the management of country, including the harbour and the national parks and the other significant places within the traditional territories of the harbour clans, are things that are practically achievable and that would represent genuine steps toward justice. The conversations about what justice looks like in the specific context of the harbour clans and the city of Sydney are conversations that are only beginning to happen seriously. The Voice referendum of 2023 was one expression of those conversations, and its failure was a setback. But the conversations have not stopped. The communities are still here. The advocates are still working. The legal cases are still being pursued. The language revitalization and the cultural recovery are still proceeding. The story is not over. It is worth ending this particular strand of the history with the observation that the legal system, having been used so comprehensively against the harbour clans and their descendants, is now one of the arenas in which some of the most important work for their recognition and their rights is being done. The lawyers and the legal scholars who have dedicated their careers to Indigenous rights law, who developed the arguments that won the Mabo case, and who have worked through the subsequent decades to expand and solidify the recognition of native title, are among the most important allies of the Aboriginal communities of Sydney. The law that was the instrument of dispossession is being used as an instrument of, if not restitution, at least recognition. This does not redeem the history, but it is something. The living descendants of the families who owned Sydney before anyone else are not simply the subject of this history. They are its authors. They are the people who are telling this story, in their own voices and on their own terms, through the organizations and the cultural programs and the legal advocacy and the art and the language revival that constitute the active life of the Aboriginal community of Greater Sydney in the present. The history that we have been exploring tonight, the 65,000 years of occupation, the contact period, and the devastation of the smallpox epidemic, the resistance of Pemulwuy and others, the dispossession and the erasure and the suppression, the survival and the slow and difficult recovery, this is their history. It belongs to them in a way that it belongs to nobody else. The rest of us, the non-Aboriginal Australians who share this city and this country with the descendants of its original owners, are participants in a history that we did not begin and that we did not create in its most significant dimensions. But we are participants in it, and what we do with our participation, how we choose to engage with the truth of what happened here and with the ongoing situation of the communities that were most directly affected, is a choice that defines the kind of society Australia will be. There is a school in the western suburbs of Sydney where Aboriginal children are learning the Sydney language, the language of the Cadigal and the Wangal, on country that was the territory of those clans. The children are young. Most of them are growing up in Sydney in the same urban environment as their non-Aboriginal classmates, watching the same media and using the same technologies. But they are also learning to say the names of the plants and the birds and the fish of their country in a language that was silenced for 2 centuries. They are learning the stories that connect those names to the land and the water. They are learning to be Cadigal and Wangal in the 21st century, in a city that bears little outward resemblance to the landscape their ancestors managed, but that sits on exactly the same ground. When those children grow up and move through Sydney, they will move through a city that is different for them from what it is for their non-Aboriginal contemporaries. They will know where the waterways run under the streets, where the ridgelines are, where the important sites are, where their families camped and fished and conducted ceremony. They will know the names of their country in a language that was made for it, over thousands of years of close and loving attention. And that knowledge will be, in some small but real way, a piece of what was taken beginning to be returned. There are elders in the Sydney Aboriginal community who have carried knowledge through conditions that were designed to prevent its carrying, who held on to language and story and cultural practice through the worst years of the protection era, through the removals and the relocations and the specific forms of suppression that characterised the management of Aboriginal people in New South Wales through much of the 20th century. These elders are not well known outside the community. They do not have statues in public squares or streets named after them. But they are, in the most literal possible sense, the people who kept this story alive when every force arrayed against them was working to end it. Their names deserve to be spoken. Some of them are documented in the academic and community records of language revival and cultural recovery projects. Some are remembered primarily within the community. Some are known only to their immediate families and to the people who received their knowledge directly. All of them represent a form of heroism that the historical record of Sydney does not adequately acknowledge. The heroism of maintaining identity and knowledge and connection to country under conditions of sustained and comprehensive suppression. The story of Sydney's deep history is also the story of these elders and of the communities that surrounded and supported them. It is the story of the families that maintained their identity as Cadigal or Wangal or Gwegal or Darawal, not as a romantic attachment to a romanticized past, but as a lived reality, a genuine framework for understanding who they are and where they belong, and what they owe to the country and to the people who came before them. That maintenance was not easy. It was not supported by the system. It was done in the margins, in the spaces that the colonial system overlooked or could not fully control, and it required a level of determination and commitment that should command enormous respect. The physical landscape of Sydney carries the traces of this history in ways that reward sustained attention. The sandstone cuttings along railway lines, the creek channels that still follow the pre-colonial watercourses under the streets, the remnant bushland in the margins of development, the rock platforms and headlands of the national parks, all of these carry within them the physical record of a long and layered human presence. Walking through the bush in the national parks around Sydney, you are walking through a landscape that has been shaped by human hands for tens of thousands of years, even if the specific evidence of that shaping is not always visible to the untrained eye. The cultural landscape of the harbour, the network of stories and songs and ceremonial places and sky knowledge and ecological wisdom that the harbour clans maintained over that enormous span of time, is less physically visible, but no less real. It exists in the oral traditions of the community, in the records of early observers, in the language revival materials and the cultural education programs and the land management partnerships that are currently active. It exists in the memories of elders and in the expanding knowledge of young people who are learning to carry it forward. And it exists in the landscape itself, in the patterns of vegetation and the behavior of wildlife and the quality of the water and the character of the country that were all shaped in some degree by the long human presence that preceded colonial settlement. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else knew this place in a way that no subsequent occupant has matched. They knew the name and the story and the ecological role of every significant feature within their territory. They knew the seasonal rhythms and the long cycles of change. They knew the relationships between species and the dependencies that structured the ecological community. They knew the sky and the water and the deep structure of the land with the kind of knowledge that only comes from intimate, sustained, loving attention over many thousands of years. That knowledge is one of the great intellectual achievements of human history. It deserves to be recognized as such. The harbor at dawn is still extraordinary. The light still does that particular thing to the water that makes it look blue and green and silver all at once. The sandstone headlands are still warm and golden in the morning light. The birds that the harbor clans knew and named are still calling from the same trees and cliffs and waterlines they have always occupied. And the people who first learned to read all of this, who first learned to understand the harbor and the sky above it and the land around it in the extraordinary depth and detail that 65,000 years of close attention produces, those people are still here. Their names are coming back. Their languages are coming back. Their connection to country, however battered and disrupted by what was done to them, is still alive and still being tended and still being passed on to the next generation. The story we have been telling tonight is not finished. It cannot be finished because we are still inside it. The names that were erased are still in the process of being recovered. The rights that were denied are still in the process of being recognized. The wounds that were inflicted are still in the process of being healed. But the families are still here. The harbor is still here. And the truth, the full truth of this place and its history is being told. It is being told by the descendants of the people who have always known it best. And it is being heard, slowly and imperfectly, and against ongoing resistance, by the city that was built on their country. The Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and the Gwegal and the Darawal and the Bidjigal and the Guringai are the original Sydney-siders. They are the families who own this place before anyone else. Their names were not erased permanently. Nothing permanent was accomplished by the attempt. The names are here, the people are here, the connection to country is here. And the story, the real story, the full story of this extraordinary harbor and the extraordinary people who first knew it is still being told. Sleep well. Wherever you are in the world tonight, you have spent some hours in the company of a place and a people whose depth and whose resilience and whose continued presence in the world is one of the genuinely remarkable things about being human. The harbor is still there. The morning will come. And the names that were erased are still being recovered, one by one, back into the light. There is a particular quality of knowledge that comes only from long habitation. It is the kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired from a textbook or a map or a satellite image, no matter how good those tools are. It is the knowledge of a place not as a static object to be observed from outside, but as a dynamic, living entity to be participated in, over time, in multiple seasons, across years and decades and generations. It is the knowledge of how a place changes and how it stays the same, of what its particular qualities feel like in the body, not just what they look like to the eye, of the sounds it makes in different weather, the smells it gives off in different seasons, the way the light moves through it at different times of day and year. This is the knowledge the harbor clans had of the Sydney Basin, accumulated and refined across 65,000 years of sustained and loving attention. And it is the knowledge that the colonial process set out, whether deliberately or through the consequence of its own logic, to destroy. The destruction of this knowledge was arguably the most significant and most irreversible consequence of colonization in the Sydney region. The land can be restored, imperfectly and over long periods, to something approaching its pre-colonial ecological condition. The fish stocks of the harbor, though diminished by decades of pollution and overfishing, are showing signs of recovery. The native vegetation, though fragmented, persists in the national parks and reserves. But the knowledge of that land, the specific, detailed, practically grounded understanding of every aspect of the harbor and its surroundings that was carried in the languages and the stories and the practices of the harbor clans, that knowledge, where it was lost, is not coming back in the same form. What is being recovered through language revival and cultural revitalization is real and genuinely important. But it is being recovered under conditions of knowledge scarcity, reconstructed from fragmentary sources, rather than transmitted intact through an unbroken tradition. The difference matters. This is not to say that the recovery is not worth doing. It is emphatically worth doing. Every word recovered from the Sydney language, every story preserved and transmitted, every ceremonial practice maintained or revived, every piece of ecological knowledge documented and incorporated into land management practice represents a genuine gain. It represents the survival and the strengthening of something that was specifically targeted for destruction. But it is worth being honest about what was lost and what the loss means, not in a spirit of hopelessness, but in a spirit of genuine reckoning with the scale and the character of what the colonial process accomplished in this specific place. The scale of the knowledge loss can be measured, very approximately, by the contrast between what we know about the pre-colonial ecology and management of the Sydney Basin and what the people who managed it knew. We know, from the early colonial records and from the ecological evidence embedded in the midden deposits and the vegetation patterns and the behavior of the remaining wildlife, that the harbour was extraordinarily productive, that the surrounding country was well managed, that the people who managed it moved through it with a confidence and an ease that comes from comprehensive knowledge. We can see the general outlines of what that knowledge produced, but we cannot see most of the knowledge itself. The specific names, the specific stories, the specific protocols and practices and observations that constituted the working ecological knowledge of the Cadigal or the Wangal or the Gwegal are mostly gone. What has been recovered is fragments. Significant and valuable fragments, but fragments. The ecology of Port Jackson before colonial settlement was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The harbour and its surrounding waterways supported an abundance of marine life that is almost impossible to imagine from the perspective of the current harbour, degraded as it is by 2 centuries of urban development, pollution, and fishing pressure. Early colonial accounts describe mullets so thick in the harbour mouth that you could almost walk on them, oyster beds so extensive that they posed a navigational hazard, schools of fish so dense that Aboriginal fisherwomen could fill their canoes within minutes of arriving at the right location, whales in the deeper channels, seals on the harbour rocks, penguins on the offshore islands, sharks in such numbers that they were a practical concern in shallow water, rays and flatfish in the sandy bays, eels in every creek and estuary. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a long and carefully managed relationship between the harbour communities and their aquatic environment. The specific details of how that management worked are not fully understood because the management was embedded in practices and protocols and knowledge systems that were not documented before they were disrupted. But the general principle that long-term human management of a productive environment can maintain and in some cases increase its productivity is well established in ecological science, and the evidence from the Sydney Harbour is consistent with that principle. The management of fish populations in the harbour almost certainly included some form of what modern fisheries scientists call effort limitation, the restriction of harvest to levels that allow populations to maintain themselves over time. This might have been encoded in ceremonial restrictions on certain species at certain times, in protocols that governed which families could fish in which areas and when, in the management of the fish traps and the weirs in ways that allowed breeding populations to pass through unmolested. The specific mechanisms are not recoverable in detail, but the outcome, a harbour that was extraordinarily productive for a very long time, is evidence that whatever the mechanisms were, they worked. The loss of this management knowledge is not merely a cultural loss, it is an ecological loss. The decisions now being made about the management of Port Jackson, about fishing regulations and pollution control and habitat restoration, and the management of invasive species, are being made without access to the deep knowledge of the system that the harbour clans possessed. This is not a metaphorical problem, it is a practical one. The people making those decisions have access to decades of scientific monitoring data, to sophisticated ecological models, to the accumulated knowledge of fisheries, science, and marine biology. But they do not have access to the 65,000-year understanding of the specific harbour system that the people who managed it for that period had developed. And that understanding is not fully replaceable by even the most sophisticated scientific monitoring, because it encompasses dimensions of knowledge about the system that the scientific monitoring framework is not designed to capture. The recognition of this problem is growing, slowly, and against considerable institutional resistance in the agencies and organizations that manage the ecological resources of the Sydney Basin. There are pilot programs that involve Aboriginal community members in ecological monitoring and management. There are research projects that seek to document and incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into management planning. There are partnerships between land management agencies and Aboriginal organizations that give community members meaningful roles in the stewardship of country. These are real advances, and they reflect a genuine shift in understanding about the nature and the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge. But they are also very small relative to the scale of the management challenge and very limited relative to the depth of the knowledge they are drawing on. The knowledge that was lost across the colonial period cannot be recovered from the fragments that survive, no matter how carefully and how collaboratively the recovery work is conducted. What can be done is to use those fragments as a foundation, to combine them with the scientific knowledge that has been accumulated over the past 2 centuries, and to engage the living knowledge of the Aboriginal community in a genuine and respectful partnership that gives that knowledge the weight it deserves in management decisions. This is the direction that the most thoughtful and most honest practitioners in the field are moving. It is not moving fast enough, and it is not yet the norm, but it is moving. The Hawkesbury River, which defines the northern boundary of the Greater Sydney Basin and which was the territory of the Northern Harbour groups and their neighbours, is one of the places where the contrast between what was and what is most starkly apparent. The Hawkesbury was, before colonial settlement, one of the most productive and most intensively managed river systems on the eastern seaboard. The estuary and the river channel supported an extraordinary diversity of fish and shellfish and marine mammals. The surrounding valley was intensively cultivated in a form of agriculture that, while it did not involve the permanent fields and the stored surpluses of European-style farming, was systematic and productive and deeply knowledgeable about the ecology of the land it worked. The river flats were managed with fire and selective harvesting in ways that maintained their productivity across long periods. The colonial settlement of the Hawkesbury Valley, which began in the 1790s and intensified rapidly through the early 19th century, was accompanied by one of the most sustained and most violent campaigns of frontier conflict in the Greater Sydney region. The Darug people, the people whose country included much of the Hawkesbury Valley and the Cumberland Plain between the Hawkesbury and the harbour, resisted the expansion of settlement with determination and at considerable cost. The Hawkesbury-Nepean Wars, as they are sometimes called, were a series of violent confrontations between the expanding colonial settlement and the Aboriginal communities of the valley and the plains, lasting from the early 1790s through to the 1820s. They were characterized by raids on colonial farms, reprisal expeditions by settler groups and colonial military forces, and a series of massacres of Aboriginal people that are now, with greater historical attention, becoming better documented. The Darug were not the same people as the Eora clans of the harbour, though they were connected to them by kinship and by the networks of alliance and trade that linked the communities of the wider Sydney Basin. Their country was different from the harbour country, and their management of it was different, adapted to the ecology of the river valley and the open woodland of the plains, rather than to the harbour and the coastal country. But they were part of the same regional community, connected to the harbour clans by the social and ceremonial networks that structured life across the entire basin. The fate of the Darug in the colonial period was similar to that of the harbour clans, though the specific mechanisms and the specific timelines were different. Disease, dispossession, violence, the destruction of the ecological foundations of their way of life, the disruption of their social and ceremonial systems, all of these operated on the Darug as they operated on the harbour clans, with similar devastating effect. By the middle of the 19th century, the Darug as a cohesive community had been largely scattered, though individuals and families maintained their identity and their connections to country through the subsequent decades. The Darug have been engaged in their own processes of cultural and language recovery in recent years, parallel to and connected with the recovery work of the harbour communities. The Darug language, which is related to but distinct from the Sydney language of the coastal Eora, is being worked on by community members and linguists, drawing on the available documentation and on the oral memories of the community. The connections between the Darug country and the harbour country, the shared networks of ceremony and kinship and trade, are being re-explored and re-understood by the communities involved. The Blue Mountains, which form the western boundary of the Sydney Basin, were for the harbour clans both a barrier and a boundary. The sandstone escarpment of the mountains was well known to the communities of the Western Plains, but the country beyond it was the territory of other groups, the people of the Western Slopes and the interior, whose economies and social systems were adapted to very different ecological conditions. The crossing of the mountains by the European explorers Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson in 1813, which is celebrated in mainstream Australian history as a great achievement of exploration, was from the Aboriginal perspective, the moment at which the colonial frontier began to extend beyond the Sydney Basin into the vast interior of the continent. The consequences for the peoples of the interior were eventually as devastating as the consequences for the harbour clans, played out over a longer period and across a vastly larger area. But the mountains themselves, the sandstone walls and gorges and heath-covered plateaus of what is now the Blue Mountains National Park, remain one of the most significant landscape components of the Greater Sydney region, and one of the most important locations for the cultural heritage of the Aboriginal communities whose country it was. The engravings and the occupation sites and the ceremonial places of the mountains are extensions of the same cultural tradition that produced the harbour engravings and the harbour middens, adapted to the specific ecology and geography of the mountain environment. The view from the top of the escarpment, looking westward into the vast interior of the continent, is a view that people have been standing and contemplating for as long as people have lived in Australia, which is to say for a very long time indeed. The relationship between the harbour communities and the mountain communities was mediated by the specific geography of the passes through the escarpment, the negotiated rights of access through each other's country that were part of the complex diplomatic landscape of the region. The great ceremonies that brought people together from across the wider region were occasions when these rights were exercised and renewed, when the networks of alliance and obligation that made the whole system work were affirmed and extended. The mountains were not simply a physical boundary, they were a cultural and political boundary as well, managed through the same systems of protocol and negotiation that governed relationships across the coastal plain. The natural world of the mountains, the flora and fauna of the heath, and the cliff faces, and the deep gullies and the waterfalls, was known to the mountain communities and to the coastal communities who visited them in ways that modern ecology is only beginning to approach. The specific distribution of plant species across different ecological zones of the mountains, the seasonal movements of animals through the landscape, the relationship between fire and vegetation structure, and the food resources that the vegetation supported, all of this was part of the working knowledge of people who had spent their entire lives in this landscape and whose families had done the same for thousands of years. The Aboriginal names for the features of the Blue Mountains landscape are being recovered alongside the recovery of the Sydney language and the related languages of the mountain communities. The names carry information. They are not arbitrary sounds attached to arbitrary features. They encode the character and the ecological significance, and sometimes the stories of the places they name. To recover the names is to begin to recover the understanding of the landscape that the names encode, to begin to hear the mountain and the harbour and the river as they were heard by the people who first spoke of them, in language made for the specific purpose of describing this specific country. This kind of recovery work is among the most intellectually demanding and the most culturally significant work being done in Australia today. It requires the integration of linguistic knowledge, ecological knowledge, archaeological knowledge, and the living knowledge of community members across multiple generations. It requires patience and humility and a genuine willingness to let the evidence lead rather than to impose pre-existing frameworks. And it requires sustained resources over long periods in a context where resources for Indigenous cultural programs are chronically inadequate relative to the scale and the importance of the task. The people who are doing this work, the community members and the language workers and the cultural educators and the land managers and the lawyers and the artists, who together constitute the living tradition of the Sydney Aboriginal community, are continuing a work of cultural maintenance and recovery that has been going on against formidable obstacles for as long as the colonial system has been trying to prevent it. They deserve recognition and support that is commensurate with the scale and the importance of what they are doing. They are not asking for the impossible. They are asking for the chance to maintain their connection to country, to transmit their culture to their children, and to have their rights and their history acknowledged in the way that any people in any country in the world would recognize as basic human dignity. The harbour is not finished with its story. The city that was built on the country of the Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and all the others is still being built, still changing, still growing outward and upward on ground that carries a history deeper than most of its current inhabitants have been asked to understand. But the understanding is growing. The truth is harder to suppress than it used to be. The names that were erased are being spoken again in the schools and in the parks and in the public events and in the homes of the people who carry them. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are still here. They are still speaking. They are still teaching. They are still maintaining their connection to the harbour and the headlands and the rivers and the sky above it all. And the story of how they survived, how they resisted, how they maintained the thread of their identity and their knowledge through conditions that were designed to cut it permanently, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the Australian continent and in the history of the human species. 65,000 years. That is how long the families have been here. 65,000 years of knowing this harbour, this sky, this sandstone country, this intricate and beautiful and productive landscape at the edge of the Pacific. 65,000 years of naming and story and ceremony and careful, loving attention. And then 236 years of a colonial system that tried to act as if none of that had happened, that tried to declare the country empty, the people absent, the history irrelevant. The country was not empty, the people were not absent, the history is not irrelevant. And the families, the Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and the Gwagal and the Darawal and the Bidjigal and the Guringai and all the others are still here. Their names are being recovered, their languages are being revived, their rights are being advocated for with increasing force and increasing effectiveness. And the story of their occupation of this country, the full and extraordinary and mostly untold story of what was here before the first fleet arrived, is being told. It is being told in the schools where children are learning the Sydney language. It is being told in the national parks where Aboriginal rangers are guiding visitors through country that their families have managed for 65,000 years. It is being told in the courtrooms where native title cases are argued, and in the parliamentary committees where Indigenous rights are debated, and in the art galleries where Aboriginal artists are representing their connection to country, in forms that the broader culture can begin to perceive and appreciate. And it is being told here, now, in this video, in this small and imperfect attempt to render the depth and the complexity and the importance of this history in a form that can be heard in the dark, in the space between waking and sleeping, when the mind is open and the usual defenses are down, and the truth of things can reach a little deeper than it sometimes does in the bustle and the noise of the waking world. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else gave this place everything it has that is genuinely beautiful and genuinely deep. The harbour is beautiful because they managed it with care for 65,000 years. The sky above it carries stories they told across that entire span of time. The sandstone under your feet was walked by their feet long before anyone else arrived. And the city that now sits on their country owes them a debt that has not yet been honestly acknowledged or in any meaningful way repaid. But the people are here, the names are returning, the connection to country is alive, and the story is being told. That is where we leave it tonight, not with a resolution that does not yet exist, but with the truth of what was here and what remains here, and what the full history of this place demands of everyone who loves it. Cadigal, Wangal, Camaragal, Gwegal, Darawal, Bidjigal, Guringai. These are the families who owned Sydney before anyone else. Their names were not erased. They were only hidden for a while. And now, slowly and with enormous effort and against considerable resistance, they are coming back into the light where they have always belonged. The harbour is still blue in the morning. The sandstone is still warm in the afternoon sun. The birds are still calling from the same trees where the families heard them for 65,000 years. And the families are still here. They were always here. They will always be here. This is their country. This has always been their country. And learning that truth, holding it seriously, carrying it into the future, is the least that this city and this country owe them. Sleep well. The harbour is there. The morning will come. And the names that were erased, are coming back. The harbour at midwinter has a quality that is entirely different from the harbour in summer. In the cold months, the light arrives late and leaves early, and what it does in the hours between has a particular clarity that the hazy summer light lacks. The water is colder and often rougher. The wind comes off the ocean with a bite that makes you grateful for shelter. And the harbour, stripped of its summer softness, reveals itself as the ancient and formidable thing it actually is. A drowned river valley, a wound in the sandstone, a passage between the inland and the open sea that has been there for longer than human memory. The winter ceremonies of the harbour clans were calibrated to the winter harbour. The knowledge of which species were present and available in the cold months, the understanding of the tidal patterns and the current systems that shifted with the season, the specific fishing techniques and the specific gathering practices appropriate to winter country, all of this was embedded in the seasonal round that structured life around the harbour across the entire year. The ceremonies were not separate from the practical life of the community. They were deeply integrated with it, expressing and reinforcing and transmitting the ecological knowledge that kept the community fed and healthy and connected to its country. The seasonal round of the harbour clans was complex and carefully calibrated to the ecology of the harbour and the surrounding country. Different parts of the territory were used in different seasons, as different food resources came into season and as the movement of fish and game followed patterns that the community had tracked across enough generations to understand in extraordinary detail. The movement from the harbour to the coastal headlands, from the coastal country to the riverside camps, from the summer country to the winter country, these movements were not simply the wandering of homeless people. They were the systematic, knowledgeable exploitation of a productive landscape across all its seasonal dimensions. The concept of seasonal burning is central to understanding how the coastal country was managed across the year. Fire was not used randomly or without planning. It was used in specific places at specific times for specific purposes, guided by detailed knowledge of how different vegetation types responded to fire and what ecological effects different intensities and frequencies of burning produced. The maintenance of the mosaic of different vegetation types that characterized the pre-colonial landscape of the Sydney Basin was not a natural accident. It was the product of deliberate and informed management, carried out across generations by people who understood the ecology of their country in ways that are only now beginning to be appreciated by the ecological scientists who study it. The headlands of the Sydney coast, the dramatic sandstone cliffs and platforms that jut into the Pacific and that now form some of the most spectacular and most visited parts of the national parks of the region, were significant components of the coastal management system. They were hunting grounds for certain species of seabird. They were fishing platforms for offshore species that could not be reached from the canoes in the harbour. They were places from which the movements of whales and schools of pelagic fish could be observed. And they were ceremonial places. sites where the relationship between the community and the sea was enacted and renewed through ritual. The petroglyphs, the rock engravings, of the coastal headlands represent a different tradition from those of the forested ridgelines of the national parks. They tend to show marine species more prominently, whales and fish and rays and occasionally seals, reflecting the specific ecology and the specific economic focus of the coastal communities who created them. But they also show the same range of human figures and geometric patterns that appear in the inland engravings, evidence of a shared cultural tradition that extended across the different ecological zones of the Greater Sydney region. The engravings of the coastal headlands were maintained differently from those of the forest. They were exposed to the full force of the weather, to the salt wind and the rain, and the dramatic temperature changes of the coastal climate. Many have been significantly eroded and are difficult to read. Others have been damaged by the heavy foot traffic of visitors who did not know or did not care that they were walking on cultural monuments of extraordinary significance. The conservation challenges are different from those of the more sheltered forest sites, and they require different approaches and different levels of investment. The communities whose ancestors created these engravings are involved in the work of documenting, conserving, and where possible interpreting them for the broader public. This work is both practically demanding and culturally significant. The documentation requires careful recording of the engraving forms, three-dimensional imaging using techniques that have been developed relatively recently and that allow the engravings to be captured with a precision that conventional photography cannot achieve. The interpretation requires both cultural knowledge and the ability to communicate that knowledge to audiences that come to the sites with very different frames of reference and very different levels of prior knowledge. The education dimension of the work, the challenge of communicating the significance of the engravings and the broader history of the harbour clans to the millions of people who visit the national parks and beaches of Greater Sydney each year, is among the most important and the most under-resourced aspects of the cultural heritage work in the region. Most visitors to the parks and the beaches of Sydney have very limited knowledge of the Aboriginal history of the places they are visiting. The interpretive infrastructure, the signs and the guided walks and the visitor centres and the school programs that would give them access to that knowledge is present but limited, underfunded relative to the scale of the visitor numbers and the importance of the history being presented. The result is that millions of people each year walk through some of the most significant cultural landscapes in Australia without any real understanding of what they are walking through. This is not their fault. The information is not being made available to them in accessible and engaging forms, at the scale and with the investment that would be required to genuinely reach the visitor population of one of the world's great tourist cities. The resources that would be needed to do this properly are small relative to the scale of the tourism economy that the beauty of this landscape, itself a product of Aboriginal management, generates. But those resources are not being invested. The argument for investing them is both cultural and economic. Cultural because the history of the harbour clans is genuinely extraordinary and genuinely significant, and because sharing it with the people who visit and live in the city enriches everyone's relationship with the place. Economic because a Sydney that genuinely engaged with its full history, that offered visitors genuine access to the 65,000-year story of the harbour and the families who managed it, would be a more interesting and a more distinctive destination than the Sydney that presents itself primarily through its modern architecture and its beach lifestyle. The heritage of Aboriginal Sydney, if it were properly presented and properly supported, would be among the most remarkable visitor experiences in the world. There is a word that comes up repeatedly in conversations about the relationship between Sydney and its Aboriginal history. The word is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of country, acknowledgement of history, acknowledgement of rights. Acknowledgements appear at the beginning of public events, in government documents, on signs at the entrance to public institutions. They have become a regular feature of public life in Australia over the past 2 decades, more common in the urban southeast than in some other parts of the country, but increasingly present across the public sphere. Acknowledgement is not nothing. The practice of acknowledging the traditional owners of the land at the beginning of public events is a genuine cultural change, A shift in the default assumptions of public life, a small but real correction to the historical pattern of treating Aboriginal people and their claims as invisible. But it is also, in many cases, a minimal gesture that serves more to satisfy the conscience of the acknowledger than to materially change the situation of the acknowledged. An acknowledgement at the beginning of a meeting is not equivalent to consultation or partnership or governance rights or material benefit sharing. It is a statement of recognition, and recognition without consequence is a limited and in some cases a hollow thing. The Aboriginal communities of Sydney are clear about this. They value genuine acknowledgement, and they value the cultural shift that the practice of acknowledgement represents. But they also know the difference between acknowledgement and action, and they are not confused about which one they need more of. They need land management rights that are real and enforceable. They need resources for language and cultural revitalization that are adequate to the scale of the task. They need legal frameworks that genuinely recognize their sovereign connection to country, rather than requiring them to perform it on terms set by the colonial legal system. They need economic opportunities that are connected to their country and their culture, rather than opportunities that require them to leave their communities and their identities behind. And they need the history of what happened here, the full history, to be told honestly and comprehensively in the places where history is taught. None of these things are impossible. None of them would require the dismantling of the Australian state, or the dispossession of existing property owners, or any of the other extreme consequences that are sometimes raised as arguments against taking Indigenous rights. Seriously, they would require resources, political will, institutional change, and a sustained commitment to following through on the recognition that Australian society has slowly, haltingly, incompletely been moving toward. They would require, most fundamentally, the willingness to take seriously the fact that the families who owned Sydney before anyone else are still here, still connected to this country, still carrying the responsibility that comes from that connection, and still waiting for the system that took their country to acknowledge that, taking in terms that go beyond words and symbols. The sandstone under Sydney is one of the most ancient exposed rock formations on the eastern seaboard. It was laid down in a shallow sea hundreds of millions of years ago, compressed and cemented by geological time, lifted and exposed and sculpted by water and wind across millions of subsequent years. It is the foundation on which everything in Sydney sits, literally, the bedrock of the city. And in that sandstone, carved by human hands across a period that stretches back tens of thousands of years, are the marks of the families who knew this place first. The carvings are not decorations. They are not graffiti. They are the record of a relationship between people and country that is among the longest and most deeply embedded in the human story. That record is now partially legible and partially lost. What can be read is extraordinary. What cannot be read anymore is mourned by the communities whose ancestors wrote it, and by everyone who cares about the full depth of human history. The mourning is appropriate, and the care for what remains is essential, but mourning and care are not enough on their own. They need to be accompanied by the practical and institutional changes that would prevent further loss, that would support the recovery of what can be recovered, and that would create the conditions in which the living tradition of the harbour clans can continue and flourish rather than continuing to contract. The night is very quiet here. The city sounds are far away. The harbour is black and reflecting stars. The sandstone is cold under your hand if you press your palm against the cliff face. And somewhere in the dark, in the communities of Western Sydney and the South, in the reserves and the parks and the language classes and the cultural centres, the work of recovery and maintenance continues. The names are being spoken, the stories are being told. The knowledge is being transmitted from the people who hold it to the people who will carry it forward. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are ensuring, against every obstacle, that the families who own Sydney in the future will know who they are and where they came from, and what they owe to the country and the people who were here first. The harbour will be blue again in the morning. It always is. The light will do that particular thing to the water that it always does here, The thing that made people love this place for 65,000 years, and that will make people love it for as long as anyone stands on its shores. And the love of this place, the genuine love that comes from knowing it in depth and in truth, is something that belongs, most deeply and most rightly, to the families who have loved it longest. The Cadigal and the Wangal and the Camaragal and the Gwegal and the Darawal and the Bidjigal and the Guringai. They love this place before anyone else. They love it still. And knowing that, knowing the full depth and the full story of that love and what was done to interrupt it and how it has survived and how it continues to be expressed and transmitted and renewed, makes the place itself more beautiful and more real and more worth loving than it could ever be in ignorance. That is the deepest reason to know this history. Not guilt, though guilt has its place when it prompts genuine change. Not obligation, though obligation is real and should be acknowledged. But love. Love for a place that is extraordinary and that has been cared for, deeply and across an extraordinary span of time, by extraordinary people whose names we are only now beginning to recover, and to speak with the care and the respect they deserve. Sleep well. The harbour is there, blue and ancient and beautiful. The families are there, still as they have always been. And the morning will come, bringing the light that has been welcomed on these shores for 65,000 years by the people who have always been here and who have always known how lucky they were to belong to this particular place on the face of the earth. There is one more thing to hold on to before the night fully closes in. It is a small thing and a large thing at the same time. It is the fact that the harbour was named by the people who lived on it long before Arthur Phillip or anyone else gave it the name that appears on modern maps. Every bay and headland and point and creek had a name, a specific word in the specific language of the people who knew that feature of the landscape most intimately. Some of those names survived into the colonial record. Many did not. But the naming happened. The harbour was named in language before it was named in English, and the English naming did not undo the original names. It simply covered them, the way sediment covers a shell midden, leaving the original underneath, waiting to be uncovered by the right kind of attention. The uncovering is happening. The researchers and the community members who are working on language recovery are recovering names along with the rest of the language. The places that had names in the Sydney language, the bays and the headlands and the rivers and the ridges and the ceremonial grounds, are being named again in the language made for them. The language that encodes within its syllables the ecological and cultural and spiritual knowledge accumulated across the entire span of human occupation of this extraordinary place. When you know a place by its original name, in the language of the people who first named it, you know it differently. The name is not arbitrary. It carries the knowledge and the story and the relationship of the people who gave it. The name of a bay in the Sydney language tells you something about the bay, something that the English name does not tell you. Because the English name was given by people who had known the bay for a few days or a few weeks or a few months, people who were looking at it from outside, people who did not yet understand what it was. The original name was given by people who knew it as intimately as it is possible to know a place, people whose understanding of it had been refined across generations of daily engagement and careful attention. To know those names and to use them is to participate in the long tradition of knowing this place that stretches back 65,000 years. It is a small act of recognition, of connection, of acknowledgement that goes deeper than any formal statement. It is a way of letting the original inhabitants of this place speak through the names they gave it, of allowing their knowledge and their love of this country to be present in the contemporary experience of moving through it. The harbour is there, the morning will come, the names are returning, the families are here, and the story, the full and extraordinary and mostly untold story of the Sydney Harbour and the people who owned it before anyone else, that story belongs to all of us now. It belongs to everyone who lives in this city and loves this place and wants to understand it truly. And knowing it, holding it, carrying it forward is the most important thing we can do with the extraordinary gift of living in this particular place at this particular moment in its long, long history. The sandstone is still warm from the afternoon sun even as the stars come out. The water is still moving, still tidal, still following the ancient patterns that the harbour clans watched and named and understood across a span of time that dwarfs all of recorded human history. The birds are settling into the casuarinas along the foreshore. The city hums in the distance, all that accumulated human energy that has been building on these shores for 236 years. And underneath it all, older than all of it, is the country, the actual country, the rock and the water and the sky and the wind and the specific qualities of light and sound and smell that make this place what it is, and that the first people who lived here loved it for and named it for and managed it for and died for. It for and survived for it for across 65,000 years and more. That country is still here. Those people are still here. Their names were not erased. They were only hidden for a while, in the gap between what happened and what was acknowledged. And the gap is closing. Slowly, imperfectly, with enormous effort and against significant resistance, the gap is closing. The names are coming back. The families are speaking again, in their own language, on their own country. And the city that was built on their land is slowly, slowly beginning to hear them. Good night. The harbour is there, blue and deep and ancient. And the people who have loved it longest are still here, watching the same stars, breathing the same salt air, belonging to the same extraordinary country that they have always belonged to. Their names are Cadigal, Wangal, Camaragal, Gwegal, Darawal, Bidjigal, Guringai, and they are the first families of Sydney. They always will be. There is something that happens when a city begins to genuinely reckon with its own deep history. It is not a comfortable process, and it does not produce immediate resolution. But it changes something in the way the city understands itself, in the way its people move through it and relate to it and think about their own place within its long story. Sydney is in the early stages of that process. The acknowledgements of country are multiplying. The language programs are growing. The legal recognitions are slowly expanding. The voices of the Aboriginal community are increasingly present in the public conversation about what the city is and what it should become. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are participating in that conversation from a position of deep knowledge and deep connection that no other participants can match. They know this place in ways that the rest of the city has barely begun to appreciate. They know its history from the inside, from the perspective of people who have been living within it and carrying it and being shaped by it for as long as human beings have been present on this continent. And they know what the city owes them, not in a spirit of resentment or grievance, though both of those responses would be entirely understandable, but in a spirit of clear-eyed understanding of the actual situation and what genuine justice would require. The actual situation is that Sydney is one of the world's great cities, built on the country of one of the world's oldest living cultures, a culture that was specifically and systematically targeted for destruction across the colonial period, and that survived that targeting through extraordinary resilience and determination and the fierce, quiet commitment of generations of people who refused to let the thread break entirely. The names of the families who owned this country are returning. The languages in which those names were given are being revived. The connection to country that the colonial system tried to sever is alive and being actively maintained and transmitted. And the story, the full and extraordinary story, is being told, right now, here. For anyone who is willing to listen with real attention to what this place actually is and what it actually means, and who has always been here at its heart, belonging to it more deeply than words in any language can fully say. Sleep well, the harbour is there, the families are there, the names are coming back. And the morning, when it comes over the sandstone ridges and lights up the water of the most beautiful harbour in the world, belongs to all of us now, but belongs most deeply and most rightly to the people who were here first, who have always been here, and who will always be here, on their country, at the edge of the oldest human story still being told anywhere on Earth. The word that matters most, the word that should be the last word of any honest account of the history of Sydney, is not a word of resolution. It is not a word of completion. It is not a word that wraps the story into a neat package and delivers it to some comfortable conclusion. The word that matters most is still. The families are still here. The connection is still alive. The names are still being recovered. The country is still being cared for by the people who have always cared for it most deeply. Still. That single word is the whole story. Everything else is context. The families who owned Sydney before anyone else are still here. They will always be here. This is their country, and no amount of time or colonial legislation or historical silence can make that any less true. Good night. The harbour holds its breath before dawn. In those last minutes of darkness, just before the eastern sky begins to grey, the water is at its most still, and the city at its most quiet. In that stillness, if you are on the foreshore with your eyes open and your mind quiet, you can almost feel the weight of the time that has passed on these shores. 65,000 years of dawns before this one. 65,000 years of people on these shores welcoming the morning, reading the sky, beginning the daily work of living in relationship with this extraordinary country. The weight of that time is real. It presses on the present with a quiet insistence that is not oppressive but clarifying. It helps you understand what this place actually is, beneath the towers and the traffic and the tourism and all the layers of the city that have been placed on top of the original country. Beneath all of that is something very old and very patient, and very much still present. The country is still here. The families are still here. The names are still here. And the morning that is about to come over the ridge, the morning that will light up the harbour in the particular way that it always does, that morning belongs, most deeply and most truly, to the people who have been welcoming it on these shores since before memory began. Cadigal, Wangal, Camaragal, Gwegal, Darawal, Bidjigal, Guringai, the first families of Sydney. Still here, always here. The harbour is still there. The morning is almost here. And the families who owned Sydney before anyone else, they are still here too, as they have always been, as they always will be, on the country that is theirs, that has always been theirs, that will always be theirs. Their names were not erased. They were only waiting to be spoken again, and now, slowly, across the city and the schools and the parks and the waterways and the language classes and progress, good night.